Has any member been delegated authority to another member committee to vote under the temporary standing order? No. No. Declaration of interest. Any declaration of interests? No. No chairperson's business. Draft minutes of the Finance Committee meeting on the 19th of January are at page 6. Are we content that they're an accurate record of proceedings?
Yes. Chair, may I briefly, sorry, on the declaration of interest, I just do my membership of the All-Party, chairmanship of the All-Party
Group on
defamation.
Yeah.
Defamation, relation to defamation.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And you can make your declaration of interest at any stage as we go through, as we normally do. No matters rising. Agreed. Okay. Our next item on the agenda, number 6, Defamation Bill, committee stage, clause by clause, and agreement on the report. I'd like to draw your attention to the Clerk's brief at page 26, the draft Defamation Bill report at page 27, and the Defamation Bill and EFM as introduced are at page 81. As agreed, the committee will now conclude the formal clause-by-clause scrutiny of the Defamation Bill. At last week's meeting, following divisions, the committee agreed that it was not content with Clause 1, serious harm, Clause 5, protections for website operators, and Clause 11, removal of presumption for jury trials. If it wishes, the committee can formally table its opposition to one or more of these clauses, and the relevant issues will then be debated during the consideration stage. That said, it is probable that they will be debated anyway. If that is clear, I will therefore put the relevant questions to the committee. Are we content to continue? Okay, thank you. Therefore, our members are content. Is the committee content to table its opposition to Clause 1, serious harm, that Clause 1, serious harm, stands part of the bill? Is this agreed? Agreed.
Obviously, Chair, can it be registered that that's not the unanimous position? I mean, rather than pushing each one to a division. Yeah, we do that. But you also have the opportunity when it comes in front for the considerations. Yeah, obviously.
What that will mean is that it will be debated now, and the member is free to set out his views during that debate.
Yep. Also, on tabling opposition to Clause 5, is the committee content to table its opposition to Clause 5, protections for website operators, stand part of the bill? Are we agreed? Agreed. Same point
as before.
Same on Clause 11,
yes.
Matthew? Okay. On Clause 11, is the committee content to table its opposition to Clause 11, presumption against jury trials, stand part of the bill? Agreed? Agreed.
Okay.
Thank you. The committee will now proceed through the remaining clauses, and I will put the question formally. Where there are amendments, the question on the amendment will be put first, and then the question on the amended clause. We only have one amendment to consider, which is at page 3 of tabled items. Clause 8, commencement. At last week's meeting, the committee agreed to support Amendment 16, which is in the Clerk's covering note and which refers to a topographical correction. The committee asked the bill sponsor to bring forward an amendment relating to commencement dates. This is in the table papers. The amendment would commence Clause 5 6 months after royal assent. The other provisions are commenced just after royal assent and not at the discretion of the department. So it's only Clause 5 would be starting 6 months after royal assent, and that's what the bill sponsor brought towards us. Members, do we have any questions about the commencement dates or the amendment? Okay.
For those of us opposed to Clause 5, it's a bit academic.
Yeah, sorry. So therefore, is the committee content to amend Clause 18 as amended in line with the wording of the tabled items? Is this agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed. Therefore, is the committee therefore content that Clause 18 with the recommended amendment stands part of the bill? Is this agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed. Clause 19 sets out the short title as being the Defamation Act Northern Ireland 2021. Members, are we content with Clause 19? Do we understand Clause 19? Yes. Are members content? Is the committee content that the short title of the bill, with the short title of the bill as drafted? Is this agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed. Yep. The long title is given as a bill to amend the law of defamation. Is the committee content with the long title of the bill as drafted?
Agreed.
Therefore, this concludes the scrutiny phase of the committee stage for the Defamation Bill. Now we move on to the clause by clause. At last week's meeting, the committee instructed the clerk to return with a report on the committee stage of the Defamation Bill for the committee's approval. This draft report is at page 27. Peter?
Yes, Chairperson. So this is the report on the committee stage of the bill. If members have objections to any of the paragraphs, if they will indicate what they want changed or removed, and if the committee agrees, then I am very happy to do that. So, Chair, it's as simple as that. So back to you.
Okay. Any comments? Thank you, Peter, and for a very fine piece of work. Well done, and sort of a short pace of time.
Yeah.
Okay, right. Therefore, we're moving on to the bill itself. Is the committee content with the introduction from page 30? Oh, sorry, comment on the draft report. So, therefore, is the committee content with the introduction from page 33? Is this agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed. Is the committee content with the committee approach at page 38? Is this agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed. Is the committee content with consideration of the bill section from page 40? Is this agreed? Agreed. Is the committee content with the clause-by-clause scrutiny section at page 61? Is this agreed?
So we're just agreeing the accuracy here, we're not agreeing the content.
Agreed the accuracy.
Yeah, so we can still disagree with some of it, but we'll say it's a correct reflection.
Record of what the committee said. Yes,
Yep.
exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. Agreed.
Agreed.
Is the committee content with the list of appendices at page 72?
Agreed.
Agreed. Is the committee content with the executive summary at page 32?
Agreed.
Agreed. Is the committee content with the title page, etc., from page 27 and to order the report to be published as the 6th report for the Committee for Finance? Is this agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed. Thank you. Is the committee content to include an extract from today's minutes in the appendices of the report? Agreed. Is the committee content to write to the bill sponsor and the Minister in order to share a link to the report and to advise witnesses to the committee's stage accordingly? Is this agreed?
Agreed.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, team. Thank you for your contributions to the committee stage of the Defamation Bill. And
No, sorry, can I just add one point of process, Chair? Does a reminder, when does the committee report get published?
Friday.
Friday.
So now you've ordered me to publish it. I will publish it. It'll take us a day or two just to make sure it's properly accessible. So it'll appear on the website on Friday. It should be in the business office in a TypeScript version that day as well.
Okay.
maybe an hour in trays, maybe Monday.
There's one slight typographical thing on page 37, which is just at the table. I think it's where the table is eyes, where the eyes and nose breakdown. Under clause 5, basically on the clause by clause, the account of the clause by clause vote.
Right.
I think it's it has eyes, Steve Aiken, Matthew Toole. Then it just looks like one is running on to abstain. I think it was.
Oh, sorry. Yes, Mr. O'Toole. Yes. Well, no. I didn't actually notice that. Thank you for spotting that. I will amend that. So it looks like you're voting both voting aye and abstaining at the same time.
Each way bet.
Yep. No, I fixed that. Sorry about that. Thanks, members. Thank you for telling me that.
Done. Okay, team.
Sorry.
Sorry, I just have my hand up. You might not be able to see it. I think there is a typographical error on page 18, point 46. I'm not quite sure what that word, the very first word, is it meant to be members or what is that?
Sorry. Hold on. You're well ahead of me.
18.
It's
Page 18.46.
paragraph 46. Hold on. I'm nearly there. No, it's Media Huis. They're an organisation.
All right, okay.
They
Media
give
Huis.
evidence. They own. Do they own
Belfast Telegraph.
They
They
own
own
Telegraph.
independent newspapers, so
Yes.
they own Sunday Indo and
Yes.
Belfast.
It does sound like
Okay, no problem, thanks.
Okay. Well spotted anyhow. Okay, team, if we're happy, then we move on to the next item on the agenda. It's the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council 22-25 draft report. The committee will now receive oral evidence from the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council on its draft report budget. The session will be reported by Hansard. Can we bring in Maureen, Allen and Esmond?
they're in the lobby, and Sir Robert is on. There he is.
Hi, Sir Robert, can you hear us?
I can, fine, thank you, Chair.
We're just bringing the rest of your committee in. they go.
Come in or something. Yeah.
Hi, Alan. Hi, Maureen. Good to see you again. Hi, Esmond.
Afternoon.
It's like meeting old friends again. I must say, it's really nice to see you in here as well. I think it's good to see that we've reached the point of dealing with COVID, if we ever manage to fully deal with it, to actually have everybody back in the sort of the Senate chamber as well. But thank you very much indeed, and welcome indeed. As you're well aware, we're receiving oral evidence from the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council today on its 22-25 draft budget report. I'll just introduce people so that people outside will be able to link into us. It's Robert Choate, who's the chairperson. Maureen O'Reilly is the council member for the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council. Professor Alan Barrett, who's a council member for the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council, and Dr. Esmond Burney, who's a council member for the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council. Welcome to you all. Members, the following papers are related to this agenda item. The Clerk's brief at page 118. The Northern Ireland Fiscal Council 22-25 budget report is page 126. Ministerial correspondence on the Fiscal Council legislative programme is at page 179. Previous correspondence from the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council on the implications of the 2021 spending review is at page 182. The draft budget document is page 2220, or is at page 193, and an extract from the Northern Ireland Fiscal Council comprehensive guide is at page 290. This evening, you're very welcome to come to the Committee for Finance. We invited you to the meeting to provide members with an oral briefing on your report entitled The Northern Ireland Executive's 22-25 Draft Budget, an Assessment. We are looking forward to the assessment. Robert, are you leading off?
Yes, thank you very much indeed, Chair. Thank you very much for the invitation to come to you. As you'll have seen, you've seen the report, so let me just give a brief bit of background to it and some of the highlights. As you know, this is the first of the reports that we have been mandated to produce under our terms of reference. The comprehensive guide was an appetizer, if you will, setting out some of the background. The terms of reference require us to produce a report that, quote, prepare an annual assessment of the Executive's revenue streams and spending proposals and how these allow the Executive to balance their budget, unquote. So in fulfilling that request, what we decided to do was to look, obviously, at the draft budget so that our findings could inform both the public consultation and your deliberations ahead of the final budget. And we interpret balance in this context as meaning that the spending proposals in the draft budget can be financed from a combination of external funding, which is mostly the block grant, obviously, regional rates and permitted of capital borrowing. So it's not balance in the sense of spending entirely equaling revenue. You've got the borrowing, permitted borrowing in there as well. So in deciding how to balance the budget, essentially the Executive has two key decisions to make. The first of which is to what extent do you want to top up the block grant through regional rates revenue and capital borrowing in order to determine the total envelope that you have available to allocate between departments for spending. And secondly, how do you balance the competing demands of the different spending departments within that overall envelope? And it's really the answers to those two questions that get you to how the budget has been balanced in inverted commas. So as regards this particular draft budget, the Finance Minister and indeed the other devolved administrations were presented with, as we've discussed in our previous paper, a rather larger block grant settlement than probably most people expected. That reflects the relatively high spending, high taxing budget and spending review that was announced by the UK Chancellor back in October. To top that block grant up, the Finance Minister has proposed increasing capital borrowing to the maximum annual limit of £200 million by 2024-25, not going there straight away, but over time. But also to freeze regional rates and to extend some relief rather than to use those primarily as an additional source of revenue to go into the spending pot. And that set of decisions around regional rates probably comes at a cost of around 175 million in aggregate over the 3-year budget period, compared to a baseline in which you were increasing the regional rate poundages in line with inflation and not extending the reliefs. Now, both of those decisions on capital borrowing and on regional rates have a relatively small quantitative impact on the size of the spending envelope relative to the block grant outcome. So, given the overall spending envelope that the block grant and those two decisions imply, the draft budget proposes to increase departmental spending in aggregate, with Department of Health being the top priority. As regards day-to-day resource spending, day-to-day running costs of public services, grants, administration, etc., which is the bulk of the total, and the Department of Finance always refers to it as the focus of the budget. There are various earmarked allocations to departments, some of them agreed with the Treasury at the time of the spending review, some requiring approval of the Secretary of State, and others that were proposed by the Finance Minister as part of the draft budget. He's then asked all executive departments, bar health, to contribute a 2% cut in their baseline, which is worth about £118 million a year if you add them together, and that is added, as it were, to the fruits of the block grant settlement in determining your allocation, your scope for allocations looking ahead. And that pot finances a set of general allocations which ministers can spend. They're not earmarked, ministers can spend them as they wish to, in which all departments, bar justice, the general allocations outweigh the 2% cut they were asked for, and from which health emerges as the biggest percentage winner, followed by education. Now, of course, as you know, this draft budget and the set of allocations within it is not the agreed position of the executive. They agreed only to put this out as a basis for consultation, and that obviously has to raise some concern that it may not be possible to agree a final budget before the end of the fiscal year and before the Assembly rises for the elections. That is not a catastrophic, world-ending event. There are mechanisms in place that allow departments to continue to spend into the new fiscal year, but it would clearly be undesirable and throwing away an opportunity for getting underway with more strategic and long-term policy action. Finally, let me just mention at the end of the report, we identify a few themes that we think are worth thinking about and discussing ahead of the draft budget. Among them, we note that the consultation that Finance have put out asks for views on things like departmental efficiencies, other services that could be stopped, is there greater scope for charging, implicitly there's questions there about also super parity, but the draft budget is not putting forward specific proposals in the area to consult on. They are, as it were, posing an open question rather than saying, what do you think of these particular ideas? Second, as we've noted before in talking to you, and as our stakeholders have made very clear throughout the time we've been talking to them, it's very important that the next executive has a clear link between the strategic priorities in the programme for government that they'll be required to produce and budget allocation so that money follows strategy. Thirdly, we express some regret that the proposals on capital allocations came ahead of the executive's investment strategy, which might have underpinned and informed that. I think that strategy is either tomorrow or today been published. If it was today, I haven't had a chance to look at it. But in an ideal world, a horse would have come before cart. Fourth, we note that there are potential pressures on spending allocations from public sector pay demands at a time, obviously, of relatively high inflation. So there is more in the reports to read, but let me leave it there. Chair, I don't know if you want to ask my colleagues who are physically manifested before you if I have anything particular to add or to rebut any inaccurate summary I've given.
Thanks very much indeed, Sir Robert. Maureen, Alan, Esmond, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think we'll happily take questions and maybe just make comments in the context of questions.
Okay. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to limit everybody to 3 questions each because we're all very interested. But just one sort of overriding impression that I had from the report. A lot of the work that's been done beforehand, both by yourselves and the Fiscal Commission, has been quite rightly seen as being very valued, and actually has given a lot of detail and has helped sort of shape a lot of the arguments and understandings that there are at the moment. However, one of the big issues, and I think you alluded to it when you said in the first part about with the executive, here we are, we know there are pressures, we know there are considerable pressures both in the public sector pay areas, we know the issues with sort of health inflation, which has in some respects been ring-fenced to be dealt with, and we know the other programmes and difficulties there are, and indeed we've heard very publicly the issue about sort of policing numbers and the fact that we're not going to be, or the Chief Constable has advised that they're not going to recruit or bring online the extra police recruits as part and parcel of trying to get back up to the patent level of policing. And yet we've already seen that some of the levers around super parity, we're freezing the regional rate. We're not addressing some of the super parity issues on water or other issues to do with those. And there's been no real sort of discussion or recommendations on those. Is there any particular reason why you didn't particularly want to sort of highlight that you made a decision not to raise the or freeze the rates, yet there are some of these real strong pressures that are in the system?
I think from our point of view, obviously, it's for us to identify and to illustrate to people the choices that are being made. It's not for us to recommend what the priorities should be over there. So I think, obviously, one of the things we wanted to do is to highlight, where the decisions have been taken. As you say, for example, a decision or rather a recommendation, it's not an agreed position, to freeze the regional rates rather than to use them for additional revenue. And obviously one thing we can do there is to point out that actually the financial consequences of that, the amount of difference that you would make to the overall spending envelope is relatively small. And of course that's a general issue given the executive's reliance very largely on the Brock grant relative even to the other devolved administrations because of the tax raising powers. It's not for us to say whether those should be extended. That's something for the Commission to recommend and for you and others to consider. So I think our job has to be sort of to shine a light on the choices that have been made and the quantitative significance of some of those, but it's not for us to say which department should get more or less. Is it more important to freeze regional rates or to put another 170 into the spending pot? So it's clarifying, hopefully, setting the scene for people to debate that rather than us pretending we're a shadow executive and offering views on exactly where the money ought to go.
The second sort of question is...
Sorry, Chair.
Go ahead.
Can I just add there that you mentioned, Chair, about super parity, and in fact in the guide document we do attempt, based on the departmental figures, we list total of 600 million per annum. So in a sense then, moving through to the draft budget, the issue here is not so much decisions which were made as decisions which weren't made. And you can perhaps see from our point of view it's harder to comment on a passive non-decision about not applying domestic water charges or doing something to university tuition fees or prescription charges or the 60 to 64 free public transport, etc., etc. So it's a bit of a sense of the dog which didn't bark in the night, the Conan Doyle sense of the things that didn't happen, albeit sometimes the things that don't happen are actually highly significant.
And I think just leads me on to the next question. And I'll use your Holmesian adject and move on to sort of a bit like the sign of the four. Have you had the necessary responses you needed from the various government departments? And if you had the information that you've had, and things like, we've talked about memorandum of understanding being developed, and has there been a common approach across the Northern Ireland government, or do you feel that in some ways you're still struggling to get information?
I think that we've been pleasantly surprised by the willingness of departments to provide us the information that we've asked for. Obviously, there's always the issue that there may be things that we didn't know to ask for, but in the request that we've made, everybody has responded as we would have hoped with the MOU, but in the correct spirit as well. So certainly, in comparison to the experience that many other fiscal councils have with departments, so far so good. Of course, there's no guarantee that it's been relatively straightforward so far. You don't run into difficulties in the future, but I certainly have no complaints to make yet.
Okay, thanks very much. And sort of my final question. And again, it was interesting that you noticed today that the infrastructure strategy has come out. Interestingly enough, released by the Executive Office and not by the Infrastructure Minister, but we'll not go into that. The interesting point about it, of course, as you quite rightly pointed out, is that it came out before we'd allocated this. We have considerable difficulty of allocating sort of both sort of the capital spend, and I think you'll have seen that we're going to again underspend in terms of conventional capital, FTC and RRI in 21-22. There seems to also be some quite interesting accounting on FTC, where FTC's going, they're using FTC to pay down FTC, which does seem to go counter to what we're trying to do in trying to improve our sort of infrastructure as well. And Fresh Start Capital is again substantially underspent. Do you actually think that the Executive has a fundamental problem with planning and delivery of capital projects?
I might ask colleagues to come in on that. I mean, I think one thing that's important to remember is that the underspending, and this would be true at the UK context, is relatively normal, and in the Northern Ireland context, there has always been a particular issue around FTC, because FTC was, as it were, a solution in search of a problem in some way. It arises out of the Barnett consequentials of, frankly, decisions that the UK government takes and related mostly to the English housing market. And there has always been a difficulty, given the restrictions on you can only use that to lend to the private sector, to take equity stakes there, to use that. So the accounting you refer to, I think, is essentially a way of sort of of changing the time profile of that, and if that means that you are able to have a larger amount that you can use more sensibly in the future, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But if you, again, as I think we referred to in the report, a lot of capital projects proceed more slowly than hoped, partly around things like planning, partly things around judicial review on contracts, etc. So underspends on capital are not unique and not to be unexpected, but those sorts of things do indicate, there are issues there. But Esmond and Maureen may have more thoughts on that.
Yeah, I was going to comment on the fact it's probably about the first time, I think, that Ulster University hasn't snaffled up another sizable chunk of FTC, but has got a loan from somewhere else. Sorry, Esmond, you probably don't want to speak on that.
I would be conflicted, I suppose. But to deal with your broader question, Chair, I think historically, as Sir Robert alluded to, the Executive in previous iterations or applications of its investment strategy, there has been a problem with managing spend and the amount of time-wise slippage. Whether things will be better with this new strategy remains to be seen. Also, since it's obviously only just published, it's not clear at this stage whether, in fact, it does represent a prioritisation of projects, because up until now, that's what we've never had. So a sense of this is the rank order of projects that we would like done, although there's been a sort of vague naming of flagship projects, a rank order so that if money does become tight, you do the top 5 or you do the top 6 or whatever. We never seem to have managed to get to that point.
Yeah, I must admit I haven't delved into that degree to have a look at that.
I know it's something that we have had conversations about, particularly over the last number of days, and it's, I think, a complicated area. Obviously, COVID is complicated because investments haven't been taking place. So we've obviously not had an investment strategy. We had a very unique set of circumstances in the last couple of years around any type of investment, public or private. So we need to understand how that settles. But One of the things we will hopefully look at is, as part of the wider sustainability piece, is to look at the interaction between the different types of capital spend, you know, the ROI, the FTC, the CDL, and to understand how all that works together and how we can maximise it, and particularly, as Esmond said, because ISNI is coming along, and having not seen it, but would imagine that there would be a significant capital requirement on the back of that, and how it's actually used will be important then going forward.
And you'll be aware that, engaged from sort of the business community, in particular construction industry at the moment, they're,
absolutely,
I think apoplectic is probably the easiest description about sort of us. You know, we're going to have sort of part of our capital spend, you know, can't even spend what our capital is in this year. And 26 million, I think, is probably going to have to go back. Alan, did you want to say something?
It's kind of a broader sort of reaction, and it sort of addresses a range of the topics that have come up so far. But I think you began, Chair, sort of, you know, this issue about why we didn't say more about allocations and stuff like that. But I think what was a real challenge, I mean, it was never for the Fiscal Council to say how much money should be spent. But I think once we started interrogating the figures, we didn't even have a sort of a roadmap to judge the spending against. So it's partly around the issue of the lack of the investment strategy, which is now in place, because at least then we could sort of say, well, are they following what they said they wanted to do? And obviously, again, I think both Esmond and Maureen have touched on this already. So much capital investment, the integration is really critical. There's no point in having a housing estate if there isn't the sewage treatment plant or if there isn't the school. So making sure there's a coherence about it and making sure there's a good strategy underpinning it. But even when it comes to resource expenditures, without a sort of a well-developed programme for government in place, it has been terribly difficult to sort of plot and look at the expenditure and say, well, precisely what sort of strategic goals are being achieved. And of course, you're left with the residual feeling that the budget, and especially because it wasn't even fully agreed, it's what can be got away with. You know what I mean? It's what can be agreed rather than what's optimal. Now, of course, there may be very good reasons given the structure of the government, but I think there's a sort of a range of issues here that sort of struck us as we try to interrogate the figures. And I think, you know, this is something we have said in the report, and hopefully it's one of these sort of positive contributions that we can make, that you know, to sort of force greater strategic thinking, so that when we're looking at the figures, we'll never be in the position to say, well, you should be spending more on health relative to wherever else, but at least we'll be able to say, well, what you're doing is consistent with your overarching framework. So that's just a sort of a broad and general reaction to some of the themes that have come up so far.
Did you see, just to go back, because then you mentioned programme for government's been mentioned several times. We did have an existing programme for government. Did you see any evidence of it being mapped across to particular sort of spending priorities, to budgetary priorities? Did you see it being mapped across to any of the sort of cross-cutting sort of structures that we would need to achieve? I think 43 outcomes, and I've given up on how many sort of variations on it would be.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be unfair to anyone. I know collectively we wouldn't want to be unfair. That they may have been there implicitly, but I don't remember a document coming across our desk which said we are spending this because, and here's the cross-reference to the strategic action that was pointed out. So it could be there, and you could sort of argue at some global level. Obviously, the prioritisation of health has a strategic, but only at that sort of very, very generalised level.
Okay, thanks very much.
I think, Chair, obviously it's quite, if you have a budget which isn't fully agreed, mapping it to a programme for government that isn't fully agreed is a slightly odd concept anyway. But I think the clear priority, which, you know, is health first. I mean, that was stated beforehand, and that is there.
Yeah. Remember, Sir Robert, if it meant to be easy, you would have got somebody else to do it. Manisha, over to you.
Chair, just if I can make an observation as well. I'm not that sure whether or not there was a clear answer given to what... Sorry, can you hear me, Chair?
Yeah, we can, yeah.
Yeah, whether there was a clear answer given to your, I think it was either your third or your fourth question, when you asked if the Fiscal Council believed whether or not the Executive had the ability to deal with and the delivery of capital projects. I think we had maybe many of the circumstances described that could affect i.e. the delivery of capital projects, but I don't think any judgment was made on whether or not there was a fundamental problem there. But anyway, notwithstanding that, just fáilte rófalaigh Daniela, which are all very welcome. It's Jasper, lots Reese, nice meeting with you again too. And just on that, if I can move on to my first question, that the executive operates under strict fiscal rules such as the limited borrowing capability or the inability to build up reserves and carry out funding over a number of years. Do you think that our public finances would be better served if we had more room to manoeuvre?
Thank you. On your first point on the capital issue, as I say, I think the evidence, as Esmond mentioned as well, is that there have been difficulties, for example, around a judicial review around the planning system. So actually getting the capital spend out of the door on the timetable that you hope to do so is not straightforward. And as Maureen mentioned, COVID has come in on top of that. So I think that hopefully answers that question. I mean, it's not for us to sort of say what the fiscal framework ought to be. I think the key thing to note is that, you know, if you look at the decisions that were taken around things like capital borrowing and around things like regional rates, you would need to increase the annual borrowing limit, for example, by quite a lot to make an appreciable difference to the overall size of the spending envelope that the executive has to play with, simply because of the dominance of the block grant there. In the particular case of capital borrowing under RRI, it's worth making there are two limits here. There's a limit in statute of the total amount that you can have outstanding debt at any given moment, which was originally 2 billion and raised to 3. And then you have the annual borrowing limits, which, as with the other devolved administrations, are agreed with the Treasury, and that's the maximum of 200 million. At the moment, it's worth making the point that it's the annual limit that bites here. So the Finance Minister is proposing getting borrowing up to that 200 million number by 2024-25. And that would get the total amount of borrowing, I don't have the exact number here, but somewhere between 1.7 and 1.8 billion, so still well short of the statutory limit of 3 billion. So at the moment, it's the annual limit agreed with the Treasury that is the more binding there. And obviously, I guess the implication of that is that if there was a strong enough case that could be made for lifting that, then it's an easier thing to do than to change the legislative limit, which is less binding.
Yeah, thank you. And probably it leads into my next question as well too. It is widely recognised that our economy is performing badly compared to the other regions in these islands, and it is often attributed to low production, low wages, high skilled migration, high levels of economic inactivity, and low levels of investment in research and development. Was something that I commented on last week as well too, in terms of comparing it to the Republic of Ireland, where because of their educational provision and system there, 19 universities or colleges that offer higher level degrees, whilst we only have 2 here in the north of Ireland. Do you really think that the executive will have fiscal levers that will turn this economy around, or will this region always be like a basket case in a sense, dependent on intervention? Is that likely to be our future?
Well, there's no inevitability in these things. I think one lesson which is true of the UK level and economies more broadly is that making a profound change to long-term productivity performance is not everybody wants to do it, and everybody says, oh well, some combination of planning, financing for new businesses, education, infrastructure, skills would get you there, and those are all good things and things you would advocate. But the mystery of why productivity growth has slowed as much as it has over the last decade or so, not just in the UK, not just in Northern Ireland, but across the industrial world, is not a straightforward one. In terms of the decision, I mean, see, one of the choices within the spending envelope is, yes, you want health to be the top priority, But at the same time, the sorts of issues there, do you want to be putting more into infrastructure? Do you want to be putting more into education? Do you want to be putting more into skills? That is a trade-off to be made. And again, it's not for us to say what the right answer is, but the decision in the budget is clearly to prioritise health, partly because of the obvious reasons coming out of COVID, and that inevitably means there's less money available for those sorts of spending which address long-term economic challenges. But that, again, may be something that Maureen and Esmond have further thoughts on.
I think, Chair, that goes back to the point around the importance of the programme for government and the investment strategy, actually, both having really strong priorities and funding them properly and linking with each other as well. And obviously then that links into departmental priorities too. And at the moment that those things don't work together. So, you know, any organisation would work with the basis, on the basis that you have those things interlinked, and that isn't happening. There is a window of opportunity now because of the 3-year. You know, yes, hopefully we'll get a programme for government quite quickly. We've got the investment strategy. So if those things can be linked in together, then a more targeted response to, I mean, even as Esmond's point around the fact that you have had a programme for government where the priorities weren't actually clear, and lots of different, you know, objectives to it, says something in itself in terms of how anything could address particularly the structural issues of the Northern Ireland economy.
Without sort of seeming to deflect the question, I think both this question about leverage, fiscal and other, and room for manoeuvre, that's really taking us into the remit of the Fiscal Commission, Paul Johnson's commission, and they produced an interim report about which taxes might be devolvable, if there is such a word, and then in due course, later this year perhaps, they'll produce their final report. So there's consultation ongoing. They sort
of dodged the super parity issue as well.
Yeah, well, I suppose it does.
Okay, Militia, go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, just if I can go to my third and final question. The perennial Brexit has had a deeply negative impact on our budget, with roughly 100 million of EU funding lost to the executive in this draft budget, not to mention the economic consequences of leaving the EU itself. What is your assessment of how the loss of EU funding will impact the public finances in the long term?
Well, in terms of the direct EU funding, as you say, there's, and as we pointed out in the guide, it's fallen from about 400 million a year to actually still around 200 million a year. And that's a combination of some programmes that were agreed before Brexit and the money is still being paid out, as it were, and the peace programme, which is and will be ongoing. Now, the major area that has been lost, obviously, is the support from the Common Agricultural Policy, so the farm and fisheries support. That, at the moment, is being replaced by, and you can see that in the numbers for the specific allocation to the Department of Agriculture, by UK funding. The bigger question, so I think the answer to this question is, in the long term, we don't know until we know what the UK government is going to put in place beyond the end of this Parliament, for which they've guaranteed to make up the lost EU money. So what will the future farm support programme look like, and how will that advantage or disadvantage Northern Ireland relative to other parts of the UK? Now, the data obviously shows that from the CAP, Northern Ireland gets a relatively large pounds per head of population amount of that relative to the other parts of the UK. So there's certainly a reason to be wary and looking out for the fact that if the UK money that replaces it is spread more evenly, that could be to the disadvantage of the sector in Northern Ireland. So, but the short answer, I think, was you have to wait and see what is going to be put in place beyond this period over this Parliament, when they're just making up the numbers.
Okay, Carmel Maagav, Arish, just thanks ever so much once again for your answers and that. Thank you.
Okay. And Militia, just one thing. I don't know if you got a new computer or something, but actually you're much clearer, and it's the sound quality is much better. So maybe you let us know if you got a new computer, so we could all order one.
Well, it's been updated. There's no doubt about that. That was done by our own IT department in Stormont.
Also got a new background.
Steady. Keith?
Though some capital spending is getting out then.
But is it where it's needed?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Chair, and thanks all for coming along, both in person and remotely. My question relates to page 167 of our pack, or page 38 of the report. In relation to health spend, obviously it's a share, and looking at the top figure here, share in 24-25 of 51%. What is that like? Obviously, that's Northern Ireland in 3-4 years. What is that like compared to other parts of the United Kingdom and indeed other countries in the world, the health spend? And at what point, so if that 51, for example, becomes 53, 55, at what point is it too much? Now, that's a strange way of putting it, but, that it hurts every other department. So I suppose it's around the health spend. And what's your opinion on the 51%? Is it the right figure? Does it need to go more? And we always can put more money into health, but at what point does it suffer other departments more, as much as?
Well, as we were discussing earlier, I mean, it's not for us to say what the right allocations are here. Doing international comparisons is fraught with difficulty here, partly because the responsibilities, particularly around health and social care combination for the Department of Health in Northern Ireland versus if you wanted to compare it to the UK department, and of course you also have some devolution of that in Scotland and Wales. So actually doing that comparison is quite difficult, and it's one thing that we are prioritising because we want to make health a theme of the key theme of the sustainability report that we'll be putting in place in the summer, and we're hopefully working with John Appleby and colleagues who are at the Nuffield Foundation to put some numbers around those comparisons. That said, I think you can certainly say both with the UK and and in Northern Ireland, there has been this tendency when money becomes available, health does tend to be the squeakiest wheel. It's the one most likely to get greased. And you certainly found during the periods of both of spending going up and also the austerity period that health tends to be advantaged relative to the other areas. And as you say, at some point, the consequences for other parts of the public sector, you may need to revisit that. So I think that at a level, it's hard to do the comparison. In terms of new money being put in, it's not a surprise to see health being prioritised. It's the case elsewhere as well as here, as well as in Northern Ireland, and hopefully we can shed a bit more light on that. That may be something again, Alan or Maureen or Esmond may have thoughts on.
Just to pitch in a little bit there, to take your broad sort of question, is 51%, the right amount? Very difficult to answer that. And of course, one of the reasons, and this is something we're going to try and get to grips with our next report, which will hopefully come out of the summer. If there's higher health need in Northern Ireland, that's a perfectly reasonable figure to have if it's higher than elsewhere. But if it's related to inefficiencies in the system, well, that's a bad reason for having. So we need to sort of see in the next report, can we try and sort of disentangle and answer more clearly, well, why does health spending in Northern Ireland seem to be higher per capita relative to elsewhere? But I think you kind of teed it up in your own question. One of the concerns we would have, though, is that is this growth going to carry on and carry on? And for example, one of the issues we looked at just very, very briefly, but it's one of the ones that would be of concern. If health expenditure or health need grows throughout the United Kingdom in the same way, well then through the Barnett formula, Northern Ireland will continue to get more money as health is prioritised elsewhere as well. But it does seem to be the case that the population in Northern Ireland will age more rapidly over the next 15-20 years than it will in the rest of the UK. Now, to the extent that that puts pressure on the health services, you could imagine that, the Barnett consequentials may not actually be flowing through into Northern Ireland at the same pace. And so that squeeze could get a little bit more intense. And so then you really do start to need look at a very, very focused way as to whether or not it's inefficiencies in the system or really what's driving this. And could it be the case then that health in Northern Ireland will just grow, take a disproportionately high share of the budget? And again, we've touched on these issues. There are real costs here because clearly Northern Ireland does require investment in things like education and a whole range of other areas if the sort of productivity issues that have been talked about. So I think this is a real concern. Hopefully, as a council, we shed more light on this, certainly in a report we'll produce over the summer. But I think our sort of ongoing work programme is going to have to grapple with these issues that you've teed up so well.
Okay, and just following on, I suppose, on the same theme of health, do you think, from your work with the health and other departments, is health in a position to manage their money effectively? Because I'm not going to use the word, but I am. It becomes to be a black hole. No matter what money's put into health, yes, it's needed at times to get over waiting lists, etc. But if you look at the amount of money spent on agency staff and locum doctors, not that them people don't need paid with respect and they're doing a good job, but no matter how much money you put in, it's never going to be enough. So do you think is the health in a position to manage that money effectively, considering they're 51 are going to be 51% of the budget?
Again, I don't think we're in a position to answer that at the moment. What we can do is, that's part of the research that we'll be doing, to have a look to see that balance in terms of how the sector's staffed, you know, whether things cost more to do in Northern Ireland than they cost to do, for example, in England. That's the work that the Nuffield Trust will be doing on our behalf. So we'll be able to shed more light on your questions, and then it'll be up to others to judge, you know, whether or not that's what the issues are.
Well, that would be good to have a friendly, critical eye on that, or degree, because I think it's something, the amount of money spent on those agency staff, it's...
Yeah, but just to add, I mean, across the Western world, sort of frustrations on the part of finance ministers with health is and if I just give you one small quote on this, Charlie McCreevy, when he was the Minister for Health, Minister for Finance in the Republic, once made the point that in spite of the fact that he had increased spending by something like 50%, he couldn't see a 50% health improvement in the population as he walked around Grafton Street. So I know it's a simplistic and a sort of a silly remark in ways, but it really is such a difficulty throughout the Western world.
And one final question, if I may. I think we're allowed 3 today, Chair. Yeah. Regarding what we put out, for, the block grant in to Westminster and what we contribute to Westminster, would you really call Northern Ireland a basket case? Would that be the right term you would use?
I certainly wouldn't use the phrase basket case at all. I mean, if you're looking at the overall size of the notional budget deficit, so the differences between spending and revenue, taking the different layers of government together, as the ONS's regular data shows, and as we described in the guide, Northern Ireland has the relatively, you know, the largest of the notional budget deficits across the nations and the regions of England. So that's certainly the case, but that I would not translate into saying means a basket case.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Jim?
But maybe our system of government's a basket case. I think that you can be congratulated because by your reference to the issue of the absence of a capital investment strategy, I think you shamed the Executive Office into publishing their consultation today. But let me just, because you've been very diplomatic in your language in this report, as I'd expect. But it's hard to escape the criticisms and the observations that here we are in a budgetary situation with no programme for government to link it to, haven't had one for years, no extant capital investment strategy, the old one has expired. The only identified priority is health, but it's not at all identified in a focused way as to where the money should actually go. That you have a draft budget that wasn't even agreed by the Executive, that the Executive Office, the primary department, didn't even respond to the Finance Department on its initial budget assessment about what its needs were and what its pressures were and priorities. It's hard to sum all of that up without using the word dysfunctional, is it not?
It's certainly not ideal, as we said in the report. You know, you've got a set of proposals that balance the budget in the sense that we're supposed to check for, but you don't have that that set of mechanisms and decisions and choices that would, as it were, make the most of the block grant settlement that has come in terms of being able to put down a long-term investment strategy, a long-term strategy around health reform, etc. I think we've said, it's not a promising start on the basis of that, and particularly not to not have this as an agreed position. Now, you will all know much better than I do to what extent it would be realistic to expect much more than that with the election as close on the horizon as it is. But clearly it would be much better if the parties had been able to get to a more agreed position on more of the things that you have described there as a foundation upon which the next executive was then able to build and have that longer term strategic approach.
Well, again, understandably, you're being very diplomatic, but I think the message is pretty clear. On the issue of whether or not this executive, in terms of needing more funds, exercises any self-help, it's quite clear that there are facilities to raise some fundings, but the executive chooses not to take them because it's more attached to a populism than anything else. Could you just quantify for us what it is in monetary terms that they could, whether it was the right thing or the wrong thing, that they could actually access?
Well, in terms of additional resources, as I say, the main areas are regional rates, capital borrowing, and fees and charges. And the broader issue of within the spending envelope, some of the components of super parity. So on the capital borrowing, there's not much scope to add much more revenue into the pot. They're going to the 200 million limits by 24-25. They could get there slightly more quickly, but it wouldn't make a huge difference. If you look at the cost of the freezes and the extension of release for regional rates, you're talking there about something that's averaging 50 to 60 million a year in each of the 3 years. So, it's 50 to 60 million you haven't got to spend. It's not huge relative to the overall resource budget. As Esmond mentioned, in the guide, we sort of tried to gather together some of the costs that NICS has estimated for different components of the super parity, and that gets you to around 600 million. The largest chunk of that, obviously, perennially domestic water charging. And so you have those, and the draft budget is basically making some decisions on, not going for the additional revenue for regional rates, and not making proposals on the super parity areas. So there is scope to do more, to raise more money, but you can't get away from the fact that the block grant will and would remain the largest chunk of that, and you need to pull the levers that the executive does have available quite a long way and quite hard in order to have much quantitative impact on the total amount of money that they have available to spend. But again, colleagues may wish to expand or contradict.
How credible is it in that context to pontificate about needing more fiscal powers?
Well, different views on that as to whether you might want fiscal powers for different reasons. One would be to increase overall amount of money that's available in the pot. You might want to reduce the tax burden. You might want to be using the tax powers to influence people's behaviour in different ways, to do more to encourage or discourage particular sorts of behaviour. So there are other reasons that you might think there are good or bad ideas for having greater fiscal powers than simply the total amount of money that you end up raising. So I don't think, for example, in Scotland, that the use of the fiscal powers they have available has actually made a huge difference to the total amount of spending that they have. Again, colleagues may have other thoughts on that.
Chair, could I ask one further thing? There's some complaint in the report about the fact that the budget presentation is on a net expenditure basis. Could you just expand a bit on that for me?
It's not so much a complaint, it's pointing out that where the way in which the executive or the Department of Finance presents the numbers to show how things balance is you have spending financed by a total financing envelope, which is essentially the block grant, capital borrowing, regional rates, and a very small amount of money from the Irish government for the A5 road project, and that's the total sum. Now, departments also get some revenue themselves from charging. So tuition fees, non-domestic water charges, I think, being the most important of those. So the way in which the Department of Finance presents the numbers, those are not treated as being items of revenue or sources of finance. They're treated as negative spending that gives departments greater power to do more gross spending within the limits they've been given. We did try in the guide to sort of paint that more holistic picture by having both EU funding and fees and charges treated gross rather than net. It's not straightforward. One reason for that is that the way fees and charges are measured, some of those are charges that one bit of the public sector is paying to another bit of the public sector, and I think digging the weeds out of that we're going to try to do over the next few months, but I suspect it's not going to be straightforward. So you are right in that sense. It doesn't treat all sources of revenue and income in quite the same way.
So that results in a lack of transparency in relation to the charges, etc., yeah?
It would be more transparent, I think, if you were able to have all of those presented on a gross basis. I guess one of the arguments would be that if the charges are essentially to cover the costs of some of the services, until you know what the services are, you don't know what the charges would be. I'm not clear that it would be impossible to estimate that. And certainly in outturn, it would be good to have that picture painted as clearly as you could.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thanks very much, Steve. Matthew?
Chair, if I could
go
back to Mr Alistair's question about, and it's appeared several times this afternoon, fiscal powers. So, as Sir Robert says, quite rightly, there are actually at least two main reasons why the executive might wish to take on extra powers. One is the revenue raising, which is particularly relevant to what we're talking about this afternoon in terms of the budget. But also importantly, on occasions, tax variation could be used to change behaviour here in Northern Ireland, environmental policy, whatever, or indeed the classic example of corporation tax in terms of shifting investment. So there are arguments which I think many economists, including myself, find quite convincing in a theoretical sense for saying that wider fiscal powers would have attractions. But at the same time, I do understand the argument which is often put forward, which says we don't want to rush, we want to sort of walk gently forward. And I think there's some merit in the argument, and here this is a personal view as an economist as opposed to position of the Fiscal Council, because this is not really an issue for the Fiscal Council as such. It's the Fiscal Commission. Use the powers you have already better, which could be in terms of rating, particularly also the reliefs given on rating, and that hasn't really been mentioned at all this afternoon, but the sum of money there would be much bigger than the revenue forgone in terms of the freezing. So, for example, the 70% derating for manufacturing, derating for various charities, sports halls, community halls, etc., charity shops, and so on and so forth. Now, you can produce lots of good reasons on a one-by-one basis for each of those reliefs, but when you add it all up, the relief for empty property, the relief for derelict sites, it does add up to probably several £100 million per annum, between £100 and £200 million per annum of revenue forgone. So there probably is a sense in which, and obviously this isn't to and anticipate what the Fiscal Commission will finally conclude later this year, but use the powers you have much better, whilst not excluding the possibility that you might want to extend the powers, whether it be corporation tax, income tax or whatever.
Of course, there's a precondition from the Treasury of financial sustainability.
Indeed, which is very important, yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Jim. Finished? Okay. Matthew?
Thank you very much. And I think, first of all, we're saying this is good that you're here and that we have both the draft budget assessment and then the guide to public finances. This is, in a sense, a Fiscal Council in action, and that is an improvement, greater clarity that we're having this briefing today, and probably, hopefully, people who are watching it will find it more useful than some of our other evidence sessions where we're not always getting evidence that's clearly presented as what you've given us, as that which you have given us today. Just on a couple of points. Obviously, we've talked about the fact that a decision was made to prioritise health, and the corollary to that, the decision, there was an in-principle decision to prioritise health, and that has been matched with or combined with a decision to require a 2% cut in sort of across the board cut in other departments and resource spending. Is that could you say something about whether that is best practice when you're doing I guess a fiscal tightening in broad terms, or a prioritisation that involves prioritising one area in particular? Is it, in your view, generally best practice to apply a sweeping 2% cut, or is there an argument for something a bit more bespoke? That's to Sir Robert first, and then any other members of the Council.
Sure, thank you. I mean, it's certainly not unusual in the process of coming up to a budget or a spending allocation for governments, any government, and certainly true of the UK government, well, to essentially go to departments and say, we'd like you to come back with a list of decisions or projects that would, or efficiencies that would cut your spend, some baseline measure of your spend by 2, 4, 6, 8% or whatever it might be, and then to use that, as it were, as food for thought in what you actually end up delivering. And the department typically goes back and says, take 1 penny away, and that's the end of Western civilization as we know it. That's that. When you've been at the Treasury, you know that's how that relationship works sometimes. I think with this, in a sense, the fact that you've got this combination of going to departments and saying there's a 2% cut across the board, but then at the same time, with the other hand, allocating the proceeds of the block grant increase. It's really a sort of it's a presentation, it's a distinction rather than a difference, and it's the net effect. Whether you say, well, I took 2 off and then I added a whole different set of numbers to each department, which ends up with a different set of allocations. It's the ultimate set of allocations that really matters. And I think certainly, the initial public discussion and the presentation of the draft budget sort of sounded like this is an even-handed cut across everybody other than health, and the money all goes to health. Whereas it's not really that. The 2% cuts are only raising 118 million a year. In contrast, in 2023, the general allocations, which are partly financed by that, but also by the increase in the block grant, is 950 plus. So the 2% cuts are actually providing a relatively small proportion of the money that is then doled out in even non-earmarked allocations to the departments. And I think the table we had on page 40 shows you where that ends up across the chart on page 41. It's the net effect that matters, and there you've got health, not entirely surprisingly, coming at the top, education thereafter, agriculture, etc., with justice towards the bottom of that table. So, in a sense, the 2% is notional. It may have been the way in which finance asked departments to come up with potential sorts of savings, but at the end of the day, it's the combination of that, across the board cut and the allocations that shows you the net decisions that was made. And there's very clear, and it was very clear that health would be the top priority, but there's not much there's no explanation in the draft budget of why education, agriculture, infrastructure, economy, communities, etc., are ranked in the way they were, or what particular needs led DOF to suggest that particular set of allocations.
Okay, that's very helpful. I don't know if anybody else wants to come in on that, but that's a really helpful summary. No, that comes to that neatly, thank you for that answer, Sir Robert, because that neatly leads on to my next question, which is about one of the statements you make is that, and you've kind of alluded to it today, is the, I suppose if I'm not putting words in your mouth, but the relative passivity of the Department of Finance in this process. The draft budget is notable for areas where the Department of Finance has asked for suggestions, but made no proposals yet of its own. And that kind of chimes with what you've just said. Should, as you make a political judgment, should, in other contexts, would a finance department doing this exercise be expected to be more strategic in terms of how it directs departments, particularly in the absence of a programme for government?
Well, partly for the sort of constitutional reasons that we went through in the guide. The UK Treasury would tend to stick its fingers into other departments' businesses more enthusiastically than is in the case here. I think in terms, passivity, I'm not quite sure I would use that. As I say, there aren't specific proposals there, but presumably there is a limit to how far the Department of Finance could go when there isn't even executive agreement around the allocations themselves. So, in an ideal world, if you were going to, in particular, raise things of the controversy, as controversial as domestic water charging, for example, you'd really want, the executive to be consulting on that, rather than in this case, as I say, it's essentially the Department of Finance that's holding the basket. So perhaps it's not as surprising that they're not pushing the envelope on some of those decisions, which you might have done if you managed to get the executive behind, a cross-party agreement that we really ought to at least discuss this, even if not make a firm recommendation on it. Okay,
and that's really helpful. Point taken. I won't press any more for statements about passivity or otherwise. But on page your initial document, the comprehensive guide to the public finances, on page 66, there is and we discussed about the RRI borrowing and the decision not to max out the headroom. Obviously, borrowing costs are relatively low at the minute for sovereign borrowing costs, and also for kind of ergo for the executive. But in addition to not using the headroom, i.e., we're not initially using the £200 million agreement with the Treasury in the next year or two, but nor are we going anywhere near the overall headroom. Repayment, if you look at the profile for repayment costs, they're falling really quite sharply. So on chart 4.9, it would seem that there isn't a good argument for this is a declining part of executive spending, if I'm understanding that chart right, i.e. the cost of repayment is falling, so that cannot be used as a reason for not borrowing more. Is that fair?
Well, I suspect that chart is showing you the annual repayment profile for the stock of debt as it stood at the time. Yes, indeed, these figures were drawn up. So it's essentially assuming no additional borrowing moving further on.
This isn't obviously including the borrowing for it's set out in the 2022-25 budget.
No, this obviously predates the 2022-5 budget, because the earlier document. So I think, and as I say, I stand to be corrected. Whether there's an assumption of continued borrowing over the early years of that, but I presume not, as it then tails down to zero towards the end. As you say, not maxing out the credit card. I think the fact that you only get to the 200 million in the year 3 is a reflection of the expectation of how quickly, with the best will in the world, you could increase capital spend coming out of the COVID period. There is a separate question, which your question implies, which was, would you think that there was a good case, given you are so far away from the overall 3 billion ceiling, for trying to persuade the Treasury that you should raise the annual limit, for which I presume they would say, well, for that you'd have to persuade us that there is a pipeline of investment projects and the possibility of co-funding for some of those that would leave us happy to agree that. So, there is clearly arithmetically scope for that annual limit to be increased without, in the near term, imperiling the 3 billion limit at all. The question would be whether you persuade the Treasury that there's the pipeline of good investment projects to justify that.
Okay. Thank you, Matthew. Jim?
I must say, whoever's editing and drafting your report certainly has a degree in the use of English, because they're very clear in comparison to some of the other documents that we receive, which is extremely helpful to be jargon-free and understandable. So pass that on to whoever your editor is. And you give us a very, very interesting paper on the whole issue of revenue-raising powers. And it has been perpetuated for years that health in Northern Ireland gets the lion's share of the budget. It's always more favourably treated. But actually, when you look at the table in that previous report, you did a very helpful indice of 100 and comparison. That indicated, for instance, we spend a vast proportion, over proportion of our money on, for instance, agriculture. We spend a much lower proportion on environmental protection. But on health, it seemed to emerge that we spend exactly the same amount on health in Northern Ireland as the proportion of the budget in the rest of the United Kingdom. Now, if that's the case, where has this myth developed that we, quite right in my opinion, we prioritise health, but it is not to the detriment of other budgets?
This is complicated by the fact that those comparisons are not based on departmental numbers. I think the tables you're referring to are from the something called it's an international classification of what counts as health and what counts as transport, etc. So mapping that across precisely to whether the Department for Health gets the lion's share of the cake, it's a slightly different question. I mean, obviously there are smaller areas of spending, and agriculture would be a case, given the nature of a relatively rural economy, the relative productivity of the agricultural sector in Northern Ireland versus other places, that you can have quite a substantial difference in the sort of percentage there without it making a huge dent, because the agricultural budget is just a lot smaller than the health one. So I think in many ways the perception that, when there is money available, or when there is money that people think is available, health is always first in the queue. Health can always make the case for, it's a difficult winter, even without COVID, it's a difficult winter, we need some help here. It's not unique to Northern Ireland that health is the squeakiest wheel, that is the first one that gets the grease, such grease as the finance ministry is willing to hand over. But again, and this obviously is also partly in the context of these long-term pressures, partly demographics, partly the ageing population, which Alan referred to, but the sense across the industrial world that the cost of providing health care rises relatively rapidly compared to costs elsewhere because of new technological developments, because of changes of that sort. So those upward pressures on health relative to the size of the economy, relative to everything else the public sector spends money on, is certainly not unique to Northern Ireland. But maybe Alan or Esmond or Maureen would have something to add.
I think, Chair, what Mr. Wells is referring to, that there are two things, and they're not in contradiction, even if they might seem to be. So in terms of health spending per person, insofar, and we talked about this earlier, as it's possible to compare Northern Ireland and England on a comparable basis, and it is difficult because of the allocation of social care, how it's administered differently in the two. Northern Ireland and England are probably about the same. Over the years, there's been some controversy between the Department of Health and various academic health economists as to whether health spending per head was higher in Northern Ireland or higher in England, but broad ballpark figures broadly the same. But in both Northern Ireland and England, health does take up the lion's share of the departmental budget at around about 1.5. We might argue a bit about the precise percentage, but it is around about 1/2. And as Sir Robert says, rightly, across the world, health spending is increasing relatively more rapidly than public expenditure as a whole. The sort of ballpark figure that's off, well, I don't need to tell you this as a former health minister, you'll know this, 5.5% per annum to stand still. That's the figure that many people in health would quote. It's a figure that McKinsey consultants would use and other consultancy studies on health around the globe. And so really the challenge is how do you reconcile that? And it relates to some of Alan's points earlier with public expenditure, which in good years might be growing at 3 or 4% overall. So health will tend to take a higher share over time.
And that's very useful, but I think one of the criticisms aimed at the Northern Ireland Executive is that it's dysfunctional because it has such a bias towards health. But actually, when you look at the comparison with other jurisdictions, it really isn't. We haven't got totally out of kilter with the rest of the UK or other economies. We're sitting at 51%. Remember, that's 51% of a budget that doesn't, for instance, have defence, it doesn't have HMRC, it doesn't have foreign affairs, etc. So it's always going to be the biggest player. The other question I'd like to ask is that, again, in that report on possible avenues for revenue generation, you did a very interesting analysis of the £600 million of Parity Plus expenditure. In the setting of budgets, are the government just accepting that and giving us extra? I mean, is that just taken as a given in the allocation from London? Or have they ever sort of said, well, hold on here, you have opportunities for revenue raising and you aren't taking them? Are they just accepting we have the 600 million and just going on as if it didn't exist?
I think by and large, the funding from the UK is largely formulaic through the Barnett formula. So there may be particular episodes around, for example, the funding of political agreements, Fresh Start, NDNA, etc., where that is a moment that the UK government can apply pressure, make suggestions, and there's money on the table at the same time. But in the spending review by spending review process, most of the allocation is effectively done through the Barnett formula. So they're not hatching it on that basis.
So implicit in that is that the Barnett formula delivers less because of that 600 million. We're not getting Barnett plus 600 million.
No. The executive is choosing when we talk about super parity is at one level anything where the executive decides to have a policy in a particular area that is more expensive, that is more generous, and therefore more expensive than the English equivalent. And Esmond gave you a sort of list of potential ones there. There's then the specific issue of if there are elements of what is called annually managed expenditure. So this is the spending that the UK government finances for it's money that the executive is responsible for. The UK government provides the money to pay for it on top of the block grant. We're leaving aside the block grant. And in that context, if the executive decides to make a policy more generous than in the rest of the UK, they have to meet the cost of the additional generosity. And the classic example of this relatively recently is obviously around the discussions of welfare reform back in 2014, where it took time for the executive to agree to implement the UK reform policies that were underway there. But they did so with a set of mitigations so that that some people were protected from the impact of the welfare reforms, particularly around the bedroom tax and the benefit cap. But that is then money that the executive has to find elsewhere, and it's roughly, I think, 40 to 50 million, and it's one of the specific allocations that appears for the Department of Communities in the budget report.
Finally, you've highlighted the water, the fact that our Parity Plus results in the fact that we don't pay a distinct water charge. Can I say it's probably one of the most political hot potatoes one could imagine if we did try to go down that route. But if we were to adopt the Welsh water header model, have you any idea, I mean, it's maybe unfair to ask it today, but maybe could be looked at later on. Have you any idea what the implications that would be for public funding and budgets in Northern Ireland if we went down that model and took water off the balance sheet, as it were?
I couldn't put a precise number on that. It is certainly something that we would, those issues around water are one that we would like to look at. I mean, in a sense, obviously, the way domestic water charging would loosen the budget constraint is by meaning that you didn't have to spend some of the envelope on subsidy for that purpose. So, but I don't know whether other colleagues would have any particular thoughts on the Welsh model. I certainly wouldn't have anything precise to say, but I don't know whether anybody else has looked at it.
Desmond, you did some stuff on mutualisation at some stage, didn't you, on water? I don't want you put it on the spot, but I do remember you give us some. Maybe it was in my previous existence in the department on the economy committee. You give us a briefing on it.
Actually, I think I have a vague memory of in PwC doing something on different options, but no, I couldn't answer Jim's question today. I'm not even sure the data at that time would answer it.
Alan.
Yeah, just on the water issue, I don't have the precise figure, but one of the main reasons, of course, for charging for water is about the utilisation of the. It's not actually about the revenue; it's about the behaviour you're trying to encourage, and particularly water conservation. And then there is an additional theme here, and again, this was a huge issue in the south, as you probably know. But in order to actually adequately fund the water infrastructure, it would have been preferable if we had been able to move in a water charging direction, whereby then the entity is sustaining in such a way that it can actually raise money off the sort of executive books. So there's a range of reasons for introducing water charges. Admittedly, to say a political hot potato is putting it mildly, but as I said, revenue isn't the core point. And while I have the floor, if I could just make one point, Chair, on health. I think in response to some of the questions, we have been sort of making this point that health naturally tends to get more expensive over time relative to other things. But I think it's important not then to leave the impression that that means you can sort of be complacent and not worry about it. And I think it's precisely because it does have this internal growth dynamic that you need to look at it much more closely and make sure that the efficiencies are being squeezed to the extent that they can. And while sitting here, I think it might have been Mr. O'Toole asked the question then about relationships between different government departments. I'm not going to claim that I know enough about this, but there is an interesting governance point here, that when the money is being provided to the health department and then into the health system, the question is, who is tracking and asking the question, well, has that money actually made substantial differences? And I don't know enough about the governance arrangements, but I think it's something else that we might have to take a look at some stage, because I think it's part of that just overall picture that we need to familiarise ourselves with.
And I think, and sort of to support the Department of Finance, previously we asked the questions about what sort of visibility did they have the money when it left the department. And indeed, when you ask to some departments, and sort of Department of Health is a classic example, because it gets devolved down into trusts, and it's very difficult to look at that. Obviously not helped by sort of at least 5 health trusts in various forms that probably just add to the overall complexity of the piece. Members, if there are no other questions, sorry, go ahead.
Could you just ask one question? The committee was interested in the unique circumstances funding.
Yes.
Is there any trace of that the Fiscal Council could find for us, which would be of assistance?
Peter, do you just want to talk to that? Because we got something to do that later on.
I think, Chair, we're going to come to that. I emailed members earlier in the week about this.
Yes, you did.
So we'll come to it when...
But I was just wondering, has the Fiscal Council any light to shed on that?
Yeah. Go ahead, Pete. Robert?
Not that I'm aware of. I need a precise more detail of what's behind the question, but I'm not aware of that.
I think, sort of, just to ease it for the other guests of the committee as well, this is the issue of sort of additional funding that comes in from the NIO, which is directed to departments, which
not directed to departments, directed to
they won't tell us.
purposes, some of which
Particular
are
projects.
looked after by departments. Projects.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's an additional thing that we do not seem to have any oversight of.
It arises from UDAC and new approach, where there was a commitment for funding for unique circumstances for specific projects. And whereas departments seem to have some sort of administrative role, the Department of Finance is very cagey about telling us where and when and how much is involved.
I think on that, all we've done is we've, in the table showing the setting of the block grant, we distinguish obviously between those bits of it that were set at the time of the spending review, which includes the Barnett formula, and some non-Barnett additions. For example, farming and fisheries need to replace the. There was then 2 days after the spending review, I mean relatively quickly, I think by past standards, there is the money for city and growth deals and the money linked to past political agreements. So I think still some Fresh Start and then DNA. So you can see the overall amount of money that was added in that period a couple of days after the spending review. But much beyond that, I don't think we have further information. You can see on the table on page 40, page 40, the political agreement funding that was agreed shortly after the spending review. There is basically 49 million, and that's all transformation spending for health. So I don't think that can be the particular pot that Jim Allister's talking about. But do please ask us if we can dig anything further.
Okay. So, very quickly, I've got Pat.
Very brief one. Thank you again. It's for Dr. Burney. Obviously, we've had some discussion, Dr. Burney, about some of your writing on the protocol. If I may, just quickly, in your I know obviously this is out with the Fiscal Council, but in your initial analysis that was in the newsletter in August, you mentioned UK public expenditure of 560 and used that figure to add to the 850 million, which has been regularly quoted, testament to your impact, including by the member for Lagan Valley. That £560 million, now that's a cost to the Northern Ireland economy, according to that analysis. Have you brought that analysis to the Fiscal Council and suggested that it gets factored into, for example, the Public Finances Guide, or is it something that you would be willing to
it's
have the Fiscal Council look at?
Directly relevant to the question of the balance of the Executive's budget. There is a dedicated amount of money passing from UK Government to Northern Ireland Executive to handle Brexit plus protocol arrangements. Ballpark figure, about 30 million per annum, and I think largely that's the VAT check costs and so forth. So what you're referring to, Mr. O'Toole, is over 2 years. So you divide it by 2, so it's approximately 250 million, which is UK government spending, which, as an economist, I would say, look, there's an opportunity cost problem here. This is funding that can't be spent in other ways. Whether it would have been spent in Northern Ireland or would be spent in Great Britain, I don't know, and at a certain level, it doesn't matter. There's an opportunity cost.
Fair enough. It would, and I will be brief. It would, however, be also true to say that in order to arrive at an analytical position about either the cost of the protocol or the overall cost of Brexit, you would also have to factor in, for example, lost EU funding and indeed reduced
if you were
EU trade.
If you were doing an overall analysis of Brexit, yes, of course, but we've dealt with this offline, Mr. O'Toole. What I would strongly recommend is look at the Fraser-Valander modelling. They've done a general equilibrium mathematical forecasting model. They've made it, look, as always, they've made assumptions and they've produced results.
And I think you're right. That is a very good piece of work.
Questions.
I think the only point I would make, and it's very important, is that, and I'm sure you would agree, when you're comparing the cost of the protocol, and I don't think anyone serious would say that there are not costs associated with moving goods now from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, along with a huge other range of additional costs, including lack of EU labour, etc. But that when comparing it, it's difficult to compare it to a no-Brexit situation, which is what I think a lot of the analysis does. But anyway, we'll release you from our...
That's for another day, probably.
Indeed.
Yeah, I'll let the two of you spark it out. Well, maybe we have a Slugger O'Toole might actually have a sort of thing between the two of you. That would be sort of very enjoyable. Sort of Pat.
Turn on the sound for us. Hello, do you hear me okay, Chair?
We can, yep.
Thanks very much, and I want to thank the Fiscal Council for the report. I just wanted to ask, the Executive is likely to underspend in terms of its conventional capital. Does the Fiscal Council think that the Executive has a fundamental problem with the planning and the delivery? And just I want to bring it down really small. I mean, if you go out there, you try to start out a little business, the first thing you go to with the bank is a business plan. The business plan as set out to us, and as you try to read through it, it doesn't seem to add up, or it doesn't seem to work, and there's all sorts of extractions and money. What you say is there within the capital, but it's not there. Do you think it's fit for purpose?
Well, as I said, one oddity is the fact that we've had the capital budget set before the infrastructure strategy has been put out, which hopefully, would provide some of those links that you're talking about there. Now, I haven't read it, obviously, because it's only just coming out. So maybe, even though it's cart after horse, all that looks very nice, very satisfactory. I'm not a betting man. I wouldn't say that's necessarily going to be the case. There are particular, as I think we've said before, most governments tend to underspend capital programmes, particularly when they're trying to raise capital spending relatively quickly. Certainly the UK government found that when it was trying to start increasing spending. There have been particular issues around planning, around judicial review, which seems to be maybe a greater issue around contracts in Northern Ireland than it does elsewhere in the UK, that have meant that capital spending plans the money has not gone out with the speed and on exactly the things that you hoped or planned for them to do. So there is clearly work to be done on improving the capital budgeting and the management of the capital programme and meshing that into a broader infrastructure strategy.
When I first come on, thank you. When I first came into the council or into the committee, we had Sue Gray, that was the chief executive, top civil servant there. I now know that she's went back over. We're waiting on a report coming out there today. But can you, as I look down where you've been looking at or given on the health service and how you want to transform that, can you tell me where you're thinking of the transformation or how we can? I thought this would have been a major concern for all of us on how we transform our civil service, taking the amount of capital or monies or how we build into that the chance in order to grow the economy the way we want through business or through entrepreneurship.
Yeah, again, well, this comes down partly to where you're allocating the resources, which is not something for us to recommend. It's for us to shed light on where the money has gone. And the choice, perhaps not surprisingly at the moment, is that health is the highest priority, given the historic issues in Northern Ireland and the particular challenges of COVID. And that means that there is less money available for education, skills, infrastructure, than there otherwise would be purely as a matter of arithmetic, and those things you would contribute to economic performance. So at the margin, health is sucking some of the resources away from that, but at the end of the day, it's for the executive to decide what the appropriate balance is between the two of those.
All right, thank you, sir.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. Matthew, did you...
I was very brief, but I would occasion the clerk on. It was just for a question about the statutory footing of the council and whether, but we have an update, I think, coming.
Yeah, we do have an update. Actually, it might be useful. Sir Robert, have you had any update on moving you to a statutory footing, and were you aware of the correspondence that we received from the Minister? Is that a leading question?
The correspondence had a sort of rough timetable of how this would extend over the next couple of years beyond the, into the new assembly period, and getting there. Then yes, I'm aware, obviously, that there's thinking, and the hope is to try to get some sort of draft legislation into shape as soon as is practical to do so, given everything everybody else has got on, and for that to progress beyond the elections. Certainly, once there is draft legislation or that is being put together, we would obviously be very happy to look at that and make suggestions. I don't have any particular alarm bells ringing in the back of my head at the moment.
No, well, you're obviously the committee's view is that we want to get you on a legislative framework as quickly as possible, and I think the indications are we'll be looking to try and get it done by 23 if we can. But that's what we're looking to do. Just one sort of final question, and finally, after that, a quick observation. You mentioned beforehand the Fiscal Commission's next report. What's that going to be about?
Fiscal Council.
Or Fiscal Council, sorry, Freudian slip.
Well, we're due, as you know, the terms of reference and NDNA require two things. The first is the one that we've been talking about today on balancing the budget. The second is on sustainability, which essentially we're talking about the longer term pressures and factors influencing both spending and receipts. The expectation is that, obviously, evenly spacing them through the year, we would do that before everybody packs up for the summer, with a particular focus on health as obviously the largest slice of the cake. It seems a sensible place to start.
Okay, and so we expect that to see in the autumn then, if we're back.
Well, hopefully before the, finishing it before the summer break rather than afterwards.
Okay, okay. And just a final sort of point. I think for us, and I think this is more a remark aimed at politicians in Northern Ireland, but I think your remarks, where it says seizing the opportunities of a multi-year budget in your final part of your report, in the absence of UK government spending review, we argued that the opportunity to return to multi-year budgeting in Northern Ireland after 7 successive single-year budgets was a golden opportunity for greater long-term thinking and policy action, especially in areas like healthcare reform and infrastructure planning. With the 5 parties in the Executive failing to reach agreement on the substance of the draft budget, this is not a particularly encouraging start. It might sound odd as being a member of one of those parties in that Executive, but I would agree with you, and it hasn't been a particularly encouraging start. But what I hope is, having, let's say, stumbled and failed at the first hurdle, we now know what we need to do, and we need to get on with it. And for that, Robert, Alan, Maureen, Esmond, thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much indeed for your hard work. And please keep at it, because it's something that is desperately needed. But thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for the hard copy. Much appreciated.
They're all there.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're writing to the fiscal council,
Yeah.
asking them about unique circumstances.
Jim, did you have a question out of the Fiscal Council?
No, I was perfectly happy.
Got your answer.
Okay.
Got your answer.
Right.
Good out.
Okay. Matthew? So you're just losing your usual puzzled look.
Reassured by that.
Every time you do that quizzically, I'm going, what's happening next?
It's just my bake, I'm afraid.
Okay. Okay, Tim, let's move on to the next item on the agenda, January monitoring round overview from the Department of Finance. We'll now receive oral evidence from the Department of Finance officials in the January monitoring round. The session will be reported by Hansard. Just before we go, Keith, I might have to step out for a couple of minutes, but I'll indicate to you if we do have to do that, to get that as well. We're welcoming our good friends Joanne, Thomas and Anne. Can you hear us? Hi, Joanne.
Yes, Chair, we can hear you. Hello.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. I just think you should all move to Militia McHugh's office, actually, because whatever has happened to his broadband or his new computer, I've never seen him more clear, and sort of the clarity of the sound and the video was excellent. So, team, we're here obviously listening to, for the January Monitoring Round overview. The brief is at page 302, the monitoring statements at page 307, and the monthly forecast and outturn data is on page 290. Joanne, are you going to speak on this one?
No, I'm going to let Thomas kick off. Chair Thomas has just joined us and is in charge of the in-year monitoring, so he'll give the opening statement, and then we'll all be able to answer questions, hopefully. And
just for members of the committee, Keith and I and Peter met Thomas when we met with the Minister informally on Monday. And welcome Thomas, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to brief the committee on the outcome of the Executive's 21-22 January monitoring exercise. You will, of course, have already seen the outcome of January monitoring in the written oral statements, and therefore I'll keep the introductory remarks brief to allow us to spend the time on the questions that you will have. So if I start by talking a little bit about the resource position, you will recall that all resource style had been allocated in October monitoring. And there were a number of important developments ahead of January monitoring which impacted on the resource style available. So additional resources became available from a number of areas, including £150 million of Omicron Barnett consequentials, an allocation from Treasury of £24.9 million relating to changes in the personal injury discount rate, and an increase in the forecast of regional rates income of £10 million. The Executive also agreed a number of allocations, with £40 million for the Omicron Hospitality Scheme, £55 million for the Energy Payment Support Scheme, and £3.8 million for energy cost rises facing NI Water and DFI roads. So when we take into account these, along with other central adjustments made, this resulted in there being £104.6 million resource style available to allocate at the start of January monitoring. Departments then had reduced requirements of a further £140.5 million resource style, with the largest amount coming for the Department for Economy. That's £47.4 million returned from DFE. The Department for Education also returned £34.5 million of school surplus to draw down in future years under the current arrangement agreed by the Executive. So these reduced requirements, along with some further minor reclassifications, meant that £245.9 million of resource style was available to allocate. Departments submitted bids of £146.7 million, and given the level of resources available, these bids were met in full. So the departments receiving the largest amounts were the Department for Infrastructure, £68.1 million, the Department of Education, £43.3 million, the Department for Communities, £18.2 million, and the Department of Justice, which was £12.3 million. There was also an allocation of £31.9 million of ring-fenced resource style to address pressures arising from accounting charges for depreciation or impairment of assets. £3.2 million of this came from centrally available ring-fenced resource style, with the remaining £28.7 million coming from the resource style that was still available after meeting all bids. So that was the resource position. The capital Dell position then, if I turn to that, if you recall again back to October monitoring, there was £3.2 million still available after this. Now, we subsequently received Barnett consequentials of a further £44.5 million, mainly relating to additional spending on Crossrail in England. So this, along with some other central adjustments, meant that we started January monitoring with £44.4 million capital Dell available to allocate. Departments then had further reduced requirements of £57 million capital Dell, with the largest amount again coming from the Department for the Economy. That was £16.7 million. So these reduced requirements, along with some minor reclassifications, meant that £100.5 million of capital Dell was available to allocate. So departments submitted bids of £4.6 million, which were met in full. £3.7 million of these were for the Department for Infrastructure, with the remaining bids for the Department of Education and the Audit Office. Now, given the level of resources still available after meeting all the bids, our borrowing was reduced from the planned £140 million to the £80 million that had already been borrowed for 21-22. Also within capital, with regards to financial transactions capital, there was £66.7 million still available after October monitoring. Some further central adjustments brought this to £69.9 million at the start of January monitoring. Departments declared further reduced requirements of £2.8 million, which meant that a total of £72.7 million was available to allocate. There were no bids for financial transactions capital in this round. So to ensure that this unused funding was not lost, we've agreed with Treasury that it can be used to fund repayments in advance of previously agreed repayment schedules. So this effectively frees up funding in future years on FTC. £71.1 million was allocated for this purpose, along with £19.9 million already held centrally for planned repayments. So just to conclude, we've exited January monitoring with £70.5 million resource DEL, £35.9 million capital DEL, and £1.6 million FTC still available for allocation or for carry forward. The Executive does wish to take full advantage of the amount it can carry forward into 2023 through the budget exchange scheme. Now, the limits within this are currently set at £105.6 million resource DEL, £27.5 million capital DEL, and £1.6 million financial transactions capital. So we're therefore currently within our budget exchange scheme limits for carry forward resource DEL and financial transactions capital. We're currently £8.4 million over our capital DEL limits, and the Finance Minister has written to other ministers seeking further bids. I think one thing it's important to stress is that it is important to highlight that this position will change between now and the end of the financial year. So we know from previous years that departments will have further underspends between now and the end of the financial year, and this is something that we intend to monitor closely. Indeed, the position in terms of the Barnett consequentials that I've mentioned from Treasury has not yet been confirmed. So any big changes to resource or capital DEL allocations will, of course, change the position that I've outlined today.
Okay, sorry, Thomas.
So I hope that's a good overview, and happy to take any questions.
Oh, sorry. Sorry about that, Thomas. We tend to be a bit more interactive in this committee, as Joanna's probably explained to you as we go through. And that way we tend to sort of do the bits. Look, the capital, we've been saying in this committee, I think, actually all year, about the indications about capital, and bearing in mind with the situation where we're likely to face because of COVID, the difficulty of spending projects and all the rest of it. And yet, you know, we've heard time and time again that the Department of Finance has been asking the other departments to come up with things to be able to spend the money. And each time, you know, here we are at the end of the financial year. And I think, reading between the lines of what you're saying, you know, we're expecting potentially more coming back as well. Because it's too late, really, to be sort of spending the capital unless we're allowed more by sort of the Treasury rules. So, what are we putting in place for when we move into the next budgetary round to make sure we're not in this position again?
Chair, if I can take on, I mean, you have rightly highlighted the difficulties with capital spend, and in some ways slippage in capital projects is inevitable. And you're absolutely right. We would expect departments to underspend slightly at the end of the year, because that is always the case. It was very disappointing to get large levels of reduced requirements in the January monitoring round, because it is too late in the year really to identify capital projects which can be taken forward. Also impacting this position was the significant additional Barnett consequential we got as a result of Crossrail. And again, the late confirmation of that from Treasury has affected our position. So it is something we intend to monitor closely. As Thomas outlined, the position for the financial year is not yet confirmed by Treasury, so there is the potential for changes. And we are also going to work closely with departments and with SIB to see if there is capital available, is there any way we can utilise it. Going forward, I think we need to engage closely with departments, as we already do, to monitor any slippage in capital spend and to try and to avoid reduced requirements being surrendered at a late stage in the year.
Yeah. Just talking about FTC, I seem to be talking about FTC all the time. Can you just run me through using FTC to pay back FTC, just for my simple mind, just so that I understand it? And ask the corollary question is that obviously we've seen that there's been an additional loan to the University of Ulster of £160 million from the strategic investment, I think, if I got that correct. So why didn't they do their usual trick of taking on more FTC, or we give the FTC to the SIB and the SIB then give it to Ulster University? Why are we doing the payback option, and why is that loan, which is a significant amount of money, to Ulster University out there?
Unless Thomas and Alan want to jump in and they're more aware of the detail, I'm not over the detail of the arrangement between Ulster University and the SIB, so I'm afraid I can't comment on that. Thomas or Anne, if they have more detail, may want to jump in, or we can see what we can find out for you. In terms of the using, in terms of using the financial transactions capital, you know that we have difficulties using FTC, and we have then negotiated with Treasury an arrangement which allows us to actually bring forward repayments of this. So when Treasury provide us with financial transactions capital, we also provide them with a repayment schedule for the way we intend to repay that funding to them. And it makes sense that if we can't spend the money on capital projects, that we bring forward those repayments, because that gives us further flexibility in future years.
Okay. John, the other one, sorry, Thomas and John, of interest, I think, is the 91 million of RHI ring-fenced resource, AMI, or whatever the terminology is, whatever it happens to be. And there was a question whether the Treasury were going to allow us to take that money forward into the new financial year. Have we had any response for that? Because obviously that might have an impact on where we are into the budgeting process.
I think, Chair, my understanding of that is that we had agreed a concession from Treasury which allowed us to use that money if the scheme had been closed, and that would basically bring forward the AMI funding. That was asked, Economy asked us to ask Treasury, could that go forward in the future years? I think we've done that, and I'm not aware of us having received a response to that yet.
All right. So potentially there might be a liability of whatever 91 million or a figure less than that somewhere in the accounts as well?
I don't think it gives rise to a liability as such. I think it's something that we just need to discuss with Treasury going forward, and hopefully we'll get an answer to that. But I don't think it causes us a liability at this stage.
Okay, Doug. Keep an eye on it. Jim? Wells? Oh, sorry, Jim Wells.
And that's thick Jim, not clever Jim.
No.
Okay. For once, I'm in ahead of him. We had the ministerial statement on Monday, and as I say, I've only been here 27 years, so I think it's the first time ever, in my experience, that in the January monitoring round, we hadn't spent all of our revenue, our capital, our financial transaction budget. Now, that puts us in a difficult position, because when we go back to Treasury demanding much needed boost to our income, as it were, it can be difficult to argue that if we can't spend properly the money we have already. And the Minister was at pains to say, but it wasn't DFP that were responsible for the underspend. Their department was fine, but you are quite a low-spending department anyhow. And he exhorted ministers to come up with better control of their budgets, etc. But surely your officials should have been on the shoulders of the relevant department saying, hold on here, what's happening? Why are you not spending the money you're allocated? Why are you returning it in the January monitoring round? Because not all of it, in my understanding, can be carried forward to 2022-23. So, is there a role for the department, your department, to crack a whip, as it were, and say to departments, this can't happen again? Now, fortunately, there's been other issues in the media, and the press haven't really picked up on this. But it does make us look quite foolish if we can't actually find a safe home, as there are out there, for this money.
Hopefully to answer a few of your questions there, yes, absolutely, there is a role for DOF in engaging with departments. However, I think you also need to be conscious is that we can only work with the information that departments provide us with. And it was disappointing to get a significant level of reduced requirements surrendered very late in the financial year, and that is a question we will be asking departments to explain the reasoning behind that. And we do engage with them on an ongoing basis, so it is disappointing when we ask them to identify reduced requirements as soon as possible. But another factor in the level of underspend, it's not underspend, but the level of funding unallocated at the end of January monitoring was the late confirmation from Treasury of funding available. So we had 150 million of resource DEL from the Treasury. We were aware that there may be a potential 50 million relating to the rates legislation, but we didn't know for sure if it would go through this financial year. But the other 100 million of that came out of the blue due to Omicron, very late in the year to do that. We had a late capital barring consequential in relation to cross rail. So I think a question we'll be asking Treasury, or we'll certainly be making clear to Treasury, is providing us with funding very late in the financial year puts pressure on us to spend that money when there isn't the flexibility to carry forward, and that's a far from ideal situation to be in. And as Thomas referred to, actually, Treasury have not yet confirmed our final control totals for the year, so there's a potential for that to change. And it is difficult when that confirmation comes after our January monitoring process. Now, to be fair to Treasury, they're working in difficult circumstances too, and we're in unprecedented times, and they are still working to finalise the budgets of their own departments, and that has a knock-on impact on us. So I think there's been a lot of factors have come together in this January monitoring round to give rise to the level of unallocated funding. But we're not yet in a position of saying that that money will be lost. We are working and will continue to work with departments up to the end of the financial year to ensure that money is spent and that we are able to carry anything that is unspent forward.
Have you made the case to the Treasury that the Omicron money and the Crossrail money, having come so late, the very least they could do is provide a guarantee that any unspent allocation there can be carried forward? Are you pursuing that at the moment?
We have made that case to them, and the Finance Minister has raised with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, but unfortunately the Treasury position at the minute is that they're not increasing our ability to carry that money forward. I think they're saying that Thomas has got a genuine Beatles Stratocaster guitar hanging on his wall. He could sell that off and that would probably clear off some of the national debt. I don't know just how genuine that is, but certainly if it's a real one, he's a very wealthy man. But we'll not go any further into his background, or maybe it's just a picture of a unique guitar that's worth maybe many hundreds of thousands of pounds. Could I just say, being serious about it, it was awkward on Monday. It was very difficult to defend politically what we were told. And I think we can be thankful that it wasn't picked up on. Has this ever happened before, that all three budgets have come into the January monitoring round and there hasn't been sufficient bids to clear out any of them? Mm-hmm. Not to the best of my knowledge. So you're relying on my memory here, but I don't think so. Well, I mean, really, next year, I think the members of the committee will be very, very concerned if this happens again, because I give one suggestion on Monday. There's a huge energy crisis out there. DSD have a very quick way of getting rid of money through additional allocations in the March social security payments. I see no reason why there couldn't be a use of some of the surplus to increase the allocation. It's £200 at the moment to those who are finding it difficult to heat their homes. I would again just highlight the unusual circumstances that give rise to this amount of funding being unallocated at the end of the January monitoring round, which was primarily the funding we've received from Treasury very late in the day. But yes, we absolutely will explore all options with the departments to try and ensure that any unallocated funding remains within our budget exchange limit carry forward. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Alicia?
I'm going to find your role the link. You're all very welcome. On the same theme, DFE handed back 50.3 million in resource DEL and 16.7 million capital DEL, and didn't make any substantial bids despite ongoing challenges related to COVID, Brexit and the cost of living. Is it expected that the DFE will make any bids between now and the end of the year, or is there a particular issue with this department in getting money out the door?
I don't think any of us can comment on the ability of DFE to get money out the door. It is disappointing that a large amount of reduced requirements were surrendered this year, late in the year, and we are engaging with all departments to seek further uses for this money. Of course, those uses have to be proper uses. It's not a case of throwing the money out the door. They have to be value for money and have to be worthwhile.
Well, but by the same token, does your department have a contingency plan? Should there be further reduced requirements before the end of the year, which brings us over the budget exchange schemes limit?
We are looking at a number of options which would allow us to utilise the funding which is available. We're not anticipating giving departments an opportunity to surrender further reduced requirements. At this stage, we'd be looking at them saying they're underspending against their January monitoring allocation, but we do have a number of proposals we're currently considering.
Okay, and the round step to TEO in respect of the approximate time scale by which first applicants to the Victims Pension Scheme will receive a payment, or has this already happened? As it was expected in late 2021.
I'm afraid I don't have the details of that. That would be a question for Theo.
Yeah. Okay, Chair.
Sorry, Militia, go ahead.
No, that's okay, Chair.
Okay,
that's me.
Sorry, Militia, I was just talking to the clerk. Sorry, maybe for the committee. Joanne, it's been Thomas, it's been mentioned several times about you're expecting even more underspend between now and the end of the financial year. And we've already identified, I think it's well over £80 million that the Department of Economy has given back. So are you getting any indications of the quantum of the further underspend before the end of the financial year? And if so, from which departments? I can't imagine it's coming from health. So can you...
At this stage, we're not so much talking about underspends before the end of the financial year. Chair, what we're referring to is the fact that departments traditionally underspend at year end against their January monitoring allocation. So if you look each year at the provisional outturn figures we provide around middle of May or in June, early June monitoring, departments traditionally do underspend to a certain extent against their final plan, so against their January monitoring position. We have no indications from the departments that they will be underspending, but just when you look at historic data, it would imply that there will be some level of underspend. Now, hopefully that will be minimised, and the Finance Minister has asked all colleagues to ensure that any underspends are minimised, and we will engage with departments very closely between now and the end of the financial year to ensure that rather than waiting to that provisional outturn is provided to us, we are aware if there's anything coming out of the woodwork, so to speak.
It's just sort of with 80 million already coming back from the Department of Economy. If we ended up with sort of even half of that quantum again or something similar, that would be nearly £100 million handed back. Would just say something about the ability both to budget and manage effectively the monies that have been allocated to them.
Chair, I don't think we're looking at handing back funding of that extent. I mean, at the minute, on the Resourcedale side, we're within our budget exchange carry forward. We're looking at proposals for further uses of that money, and we're working with departments to make sure that those year-end underspends are minimised. So I don't think we're looking at handing back significant amounts of money.
Okay, Matthew.
Thank you, and thank you both. Thank you, Thomas. I'm tempted to say that your guitar must be gently weeping at the some of the at some of the numbers in here, but just looking at these. First of all, there does appear to be almost a crisis, maybe putting it too strongly, but a real kind of systemic problem with DFE in terms of handing back money and reduced requirements. I say that because if you look at some of the other departments, the biggest reduced requirements are, now you don't want the reduced requirements, but they're around COVID, where there's probably a degree of uncertainty built into the ability to spend the money. The EFC have their biggest reduced requirement is 14 million for labour market interventions. Some of that presumably is because hopefully the labour market's a bit more buoyant than we thought, or I don't know if that's why it is, but there is a degree of uncertainty built into the COVID-19 stuff. Most of the education departments reduced requirements, in fact all of them in resource terms, well, apart from school surplus drawdown, which is obviously distinct, but lots of the other smaller ones are COVID-19 ones. And whereas for the economy department, I mean, some of these are, the biggest single item is COVID, but actually there are lots of other ones that are education authority, funding for further education funding, and various other bits. I mean, is there and it is worth saying actually that in a sense the Department of Economy has less excuse for not getting the COVID funding out the door, because that's the bit where businesses still need support, if you see what I mean. Whereas other departments, some of the COVID stuff is inherently a little more uncertain. We know that whether it's travel agents or certain areas of hospitality are still in acute need. So I'm asking, I guess, is the Department of Finance of the view that there is a particular problem in the Department of Economy around spending money?
I wouldn't like to comment on whether there is an issue with the Department for Economy per se. What I will say is that we will engage with the Department for Economy to find out the reasons behind some of these reduced requirements, and certainly we'll be looking for assurances from all departments that they won't be underspending to the same extent at the end of the year.
Now, for the rest of the year, in terms of spending money, probably lots of people would think that one of the areas where you might want to move quickly to spend out money would be in areas where there's still business need, where the people who've fallen through the gaps or particular sectors. We've heard about travel agents here, we've heard about, I hear still about freelancers in the nighttime economy and the creative industries who have, perhaps, as for example, been very impacted by the COVID, by the Omicron shutdowns, but haven't seen particular support. But isn't there a challenge that those obvious areas where you might want to do some spending out by the end of the year need to be done by a department in whom presumably you have less trust now that they have the capacity to do that spending? I mean, presumably that's a test that you as finance department will have to ask challenging questions of the economy department's ability to spend that money.
Yeah, I think 2 important points there. Yes, you're absolutely right. If further support's needed, it needs to be the department with policy responsibility for that area that comes forward with proposals for that support. And you're absolutely right that before we give additional funding to any department at this stage in the financial year, we'll be asking for assurances from them that they can actually spend that money this year.
Okay, thanks. I suppose my final question would be, now, the department, particularly yourself, Joanne, always very good evidence sessions, although a few months ago I was slightly put in my place when I asked about overcommitment. Not that I'm saying I was vindicated, but would it have been possible a few months ago for the department, am I wrong to say that a very large amount of reduced requirements and unallocated 100 million mean that it turns out after all that the department could have made an overcommitment at that time? Or is that
well, you'll not be surprised when I say hindsight would be a wonderful thing, but we didn't have that at the time. So at that time, all the funding had been allocated. We didn't know we were going to get this level of funding from Treasury, and we certainly didn't expect departments to surrender this level of reduced requirements. So hindsight's a wonderful thing, but at the time the advice was correct. I would not have advised Finance Minister to overcommit in the October monitoring round, because we would not have anticipated this level of funding becoming available.
Okay, I sort of expected to say that, but fair enough. Thank you for answering it anyway.
Jim?
Could I say, Chair, I don't share the sense of shame in handing back money to our own Treasury. It collects from us all as taxpayers in circumstances where our nation's national debt is something like approaching 2.5 trillion. So I just want to distance myself from this anathema of handing money back. Better to hand it back than to squander it, which has been the story far too often. 2 questions, if I might. Taking up the point about RHI that the Chair raised, can you clarify for me, is it still or is it executive policy to close the RHI scheme? And is there a plan to do that?
I'm afraid I couldn't answer at this point because I'm not aware of what stage that is at in consideration with the executive, so I'm afraid I couldn't give you any clarity on that. Can I just say in regards to your first point, I think that was what I was trying to refer to, is not squandering money, because regardless of the need to spend money before the end of the financial year, it has to be on worthwhile proposals and demonstrate value for money. So it's not a case of throwing money out the door. So you're absolutely right on that point.
And of course we're in that position because we've got more from the Treasury than anyone anticipated.
Yes.
Just on the RHI, the manner in which that scheme is set up is that until I think it's 2040 something, we're going to be receiving funds, which till now we've been unable to spend because of the drastic reductions made in the RHI payments. Is that correct?
I wouldn't want to answer that at this stage because I'm not completely over the detail of the RHI scheme, so I wouldn't want to give you information that was wrong. So it's something we could come back to you on if you want us to.
Yes. Well, something else then. At successive monitoring rounds, we were told, particularly at the June monitoring round on the victims' pension scheme, that it was expected that victims would be in receipt of payment in late 2021. How many victims are in receipt of payment now that we're into 2022?
Again, I don't have that information. Be a matter for the Executive Office. We have provided the funding that we have been requested. That has. I honestly couldn't comment on how many victims received payment yet.
Or could it be that none, or a number in single figures only, have received payment?
I honestly don't know the answer to that question. It could possibly be the case. I just don't know.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much, Eddie. Keith?
Yeah, just a quick point. Joanne, Thomas and Anne, I was going to call you Anne Scott official, but it should be Anne Scott. I apologise for that, Anne. So just on the January monitoring outcome, you referred to, Joanne, the maximum we can return, as we call it, in capital is we've got 35.9, if I'm reading these figures correct, and the maximum we can hold on to is 27.5, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So what happens to that figure in the meantime, Joanne, the difference there, and what's the thinking on that additional capital we have?
Right. Nothing happens immediately on that, so it's sitting as unallocated and we will look at proposals to spend that. We're also waiting on Treasury confirming our final plan position for the year, so there could be some changes around that. Treasury could change our capital Dell allocation, which would affect that figure. So nothing happens with it at the moment. We work through the end of the financial year, we look at proposals to spend it, we see what our final plan capital is. Should we still be in a position at the end of the year when we do provisional outturn in sort of May, June time, where the amount of unallocated or unspent capital exceeds the amount we can carry forward under the budget exchange scheme, then that funding goes back to Treasury and would be lost to the Executive. But we're not at that point at this stage. There's a number of options and a number of uncertainties still there around that figure. So we highlighted to the Assembly and to yourselves the position as it was at the January monitoring round, but that is not the final position for the year at this stage.
Okay, thank you. I think it's worth noting on Jim's point, it's better to return money than squander money, because some departments have ran dozens of schemes and they put out money, COVID schemes across. I appreciate that's been over 1 or 2 years. That's probably stretched those departments, but it's better to do that wisely than squander it. All the departments, they have to be pushed and shouted at to produce 1 or 2 schemes. So I think the Department of Economy, to be fair, has done well and put a lot of money out over a period of time, and it's better because if they put it out wrongly, rightly so, people will be asking questions. So I suppose it's better putting it back than dishing it out ineffectively. But they have been effective in getting the money out where it's been needed, whereas other departments, and I'll emphasise, have been pushed and screaming to support some sectors under their department control, and they haven't done it, and they've been pushed to do it. So I just wanted to make that for the record. So thank you, Joanne, Thomas and Anne. Appreciate your information.
Okay, thanks. Joanne, just a quick one, Joanne and Thomas. The Crossrail money, when did we know we were getting the Barnett consequential for the Crossrail?
I'm going to defer to Thomas or Anne on that. I don't have the date.
I think it was in December, Anne?
Correct, it was in December.
Yeah, in December, so similar to the Omicron resource Dell money, which would have been in December as well. So obviously quite a significant amount of money on both resource and capital Dell to arrive just before January monitoring.
And that was on our subdivision of the. I mean, it's quite a lot of money, but was it in the? I mean, TfL got an extra. I can't remember how many billion they got for finishing off Crossrail. So, do we get Barnett consequentials as well for overruns on HS2?
We would do, yes. If they allocate additional funding to HS2, we will get Barnett on that.
Okay, and well, obviously it's very important that we get Crossrail finished and HS2 done, but we'll monitor that one closely. But thanks very much indeed. Okay, team, as usual, thank you very much indeed. Thanks very much indeed for your hard work, and we look forward to seeing you again in the not too distant future. Okay, keep safe.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
So, Chair, I want to write to the department seeking information on RHI, victims' payments, and University of Ulster and FTC.
Yeah, University of Ulster and FTC. Just an explanation of how and whatever that does. Okay, and we had some discussion as we were going through earlier on about unique circumstances funding. Peter shared the previous correspondence relating to circumstances funding. In brief, this appears to be a £40 million fund which is agreed between party leaders at the NDA talks.
I think Pat's still online.
Stephen, sorry, could you mute Pat?
Oh, it's Pat Stiller, is he? Okay. So, in brief, this appears to be a £40 million fund that was agreed between party leaders. No, it wasn't, because I was there, and it wasn't agreed by me at the NDNA talks. A further political agreement seems to have been ratified by a board composed of First Minister and Deputy First Minister and the Secretary of State in January 2020. Bids were sought from Department and other groups in respect of the measures that were to be supported, as indicated on page 53 of the NDNA. Some departments made bids, but no information has been provided on which bids were successful. Allocations are the sole responsibility of the NIO, which has previously declined to provide further information. Any thoughts, team?
Why have we been kept in the dark?
Yeah, exactly. I think that is a common view. So therefore, I think with your agreement, I'd like to write to the Secretary of State, copying the
Executive Office.
Committee for the, I was trying to what's that? Committee for the Executive Office and Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, seeking details of the unique circumstances, bids and allocations. Actually, can we also copy it to the Fiscal Council? Okay. I think that would be useful. Seeking details of the unique circumstances, bids and allocations and related timescales for funding, and indicating that if the information is not forthcoming, the committee will explore legal options to compel others to provide the information in question. I think that is fair. Are we agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Moving on to the LCM, item number 9 on the agenda, public sector pensions. Members sent papers relating to the agenda item are at page Peter's brief at page 361, departmental briefing paper at 363, previous related correspondence at page 370, responses from ICTU and the Community Trade Union at pages 5 and 7. And a copy of the LCM covering note from the departments at page 8 of the tabled items.
Chair, I think Melissa wants to come in.
Right.
Go ahead, Melissa.
Chair, just on the last item, you're right to the Executive Office. Could we have a copy of that letter as well, too, that you're sending to the Executive Office?
Oh, yes, certainly. Yeah.
Sorry, no, the letters to the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland? Sorry.
Yeah.
So, sorry, you're copying it to the Executive Office? Is that what the member said?
Sorry, go ahead, Melissa. I didn't hear what you said.
Right, what was you said you were writing to the Executive Office, yeah? Was it?
No, the Committee for the Executive Office.
Yeah.
So, sorry, no, we're writing to the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and copying the Committee for the Executive Office because they have...
All right, okay. Well. So I'd appreciate if we could get a copy of that as well, too.
Oh, yes.
Okay, next week.
Yeah, no, he just wants to see a copy of the letter we're sending.
Okay.
Right. We do it. No,
right.
There we go. Okay. Right. Okay. I think when we last looked at this, the committee agreed to seek further written or oral evidence from NIC-ICTU in respect of the second LCM relating to public sector pensions. NIC-ICTU has confirmed that representatives are unable to attend, so they're only able to provide written evidence. The LCM is understood to refer to the Westminster Public Service Pensions and Judicial Offices Bill in respect of the cost cap mechanism used for public sector pensions. The Department has clarified that the associated changes to the cost cap mechanism will apply from the 2020 valuation and all future valuations. The LCM will seek to bring Northern Ireland into line with the rest of our nation in respect of the changes to the cost cap mechanism that have been added to the bill. The Department argued that if the LCM is not approved, there may be an adverse impact on the block grant, as the Executive may have to meet the costs of cost cap breaches in Northern Ireland public sector pensions, which have been disallowed by these provisions. The LCM will provide the legacy public sector pension schemes from the will remove the legacy public sector pension schemes from the calculation of the cost cap. According to the Department, Treasury will assume the associated risks. Thus, the reformed schemes will not have to meet the costs of underperformance by these schemes, nor will they enjoy the benefits if these schemes overperform. The LCM will introduce a link between the calculation of cost cap breaches and the UK's long-term GDP. Thus, if cost cap breaches are calculated, positive corrective measures Increased benefits or reduced contributions would only take place if the cost cap would have occurred had long-term economic assumptions, including probably long-term GDP, being considered. So this is an extra hurdle for pension cost cap mechanism breaches, the details of which have not been determined. The Community Trade Union and NIC ICTU have indicated disquiet about the speed of this amendment and all of those changes to the cost cap mechanism. They refer to other legal proceedings. Members, do we have any comments?
When did we become aware of this?
Chair, I think the department wrote to us about this, I think, would have been early in January. Yep. So what's happened is, if you recall, back in September, there was an LCM all about this. That the Assembly passed that. Westminster went about its work, did its job, and has now made some amendments to the bill. And it turns out these amendments will require legislation for Northern Ireland. That's why you need an LCM.
But we discussed another LCM last week.
It's the same thing.
Same one.
It's the same issue.
Yep,
right.
same
Okay.
thing. So if you recall, last week the department came and briefed about it, and we sought evidence from the unions. They're not able to come, but they've written about it, and their letter is in tabled items.
Okay.
So, Tim, we've got two options.
Yeah, that's something through the chair. Just it should be noted that the unions themselves feel that this will negatively have an impact on their members.
Okay. But look, Tim, we've got two options on this one. We can support the LCM, but I think if we do, we should express reservations and seek assurances from the Minister. So he's looking at these issues. Or we can oppose the LCM, but then we need to set out the committee's reasons. Bearing in mind the timelines, what's the committee's views? Keith, what's the deputy?
I would go with the first one. Support the LCM. Okay. And set out reservations, any that we do have, or boil up.
Elisa?
Yeah. And I would agree with that.
Okay. Matthew?
I'm not sure I'd be willing to give a clear view, my view or the party view at the minute, but I'm not going to raise any particular objections. I'm not going to declare objections to the LCM.
James?
Don't think we have a lot of option, have we?
Okay. Gemma?
Sorry, Chair. Yeah, I agree with Militia and Keith.
Okay, thanks. Pat?
I don't think we have a lot of options either, so I'm in agreement.
Look, I don't want to put it to a vote, team, because I think we're in a position where I think we support the LCM, but we must express our reservations and seek assurances from the Minister if we are agreed. Are we agreed? Agreed.
So, Chair, are the reservations, you're seeking clarity about whether Treasury will indeed take on the
additional the cost overrun?
Yeah, sorry, no, it's about the legacy schemes and the risk associated. So the department said that the Treasury would assume the associated risks, but the letter from the union seems to suggest that it wouldn't. So clarity there. And I guess is the committee indicating just disquiet about changes to the cost cap mechanism and the prospect of any possible adverse impact for members, and maybe also the timing?
Yes, well done.
Okay. And does committee consent for the chair to indicate same in the debate, which I think might be next week?
Monday, I think.
Monday,
yeah. I think if I would be content to express those views from the floor if the committee was content. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Moving on to agenda number 10, subordinate legislation, energy performance certificates. The Department has proposed to make a statutory rule the Energy Performance of Building Certificates and Inspections Amendment Regulations Northern Ireland 2022. The rule amends the Energy Performance of Building Certificates and Inspection Regulations Northern Ireland 2008. The purpose of the statutory rule is to reduce the statutory fees that are charged when data is registered for energy performance certificates, display energy certificates and air conditioning inspection reports for domestic settings from £1.64 to £1.50 and for non-domestic settings for £1.89 to £1.70. There has been no consultation and the change replicates arrangements in England and Wales. It is proposed that the changes will be made from the 1st of April 2022 and the rule will be subject to draft affirmative assembly procedure. Any views from the members? Okay. In that case, then, is the committee content with the policy objectives of the proposed rule, and it is therefore content for the department to make the rule? Is this agreed? Agreed. Okay. Thank you. Moving on to correspondence. There are 11 received items of correspondence at page 402. First is the rates valuation COVID restrictions. The committee is asked to note at page 405 a departmental response to the committee's request for sight of correspondence for the Commissioner Evaluation and Director of Rating Policy to the Minister, which relates to the non-domestic rates valuation coronavirus bill. Jim, do you want to talk to that? That was the one you asked about.
Did I? Oh. I hadn't realised.
Are we content to note? Okay, content to note.
Yes.
PSTF achievements. The committee is asked to consider at page 433 a departmental response to the committee's queries on the Public Sector Transformation Fund and its use to support a voluntary exit scheme in the Northern Ireland Civil Service and wider public sector. The purpose of the scheme is given to reduce pay bills, such as the reduction in size of the NICS and wider public sector. Fresh Start Agreement indicates that between April 2014 and March 2016, the Northern Ireland Civil Service is set to reduce headcount by approximately 5,210, and a further 2,000 exits from the wider public sector by a recruitment freeze and a voluntary exit scheme. The Department appears to argue that this was largely achieved as around 6,600 exits were facilitated from the Northern Ireland Civil Service and the wider public sector combined. The Department also disputes that staffing levels in the Northern Ireland Civil Service have returned to pre-VES levels, as the level of permanent FT full-time equivalents in the Northern Ireland Civil Service is now 3,000 fewer than in 2015. However, members will recall that on the 24th of November 2021, the Permanent Secretary indicated in oral evidence to the committee that we have recently reached our pre-VES levels of employment in the Northern Ireland Civil Service. Previous departmental correspondence, which is page 19 of tabled items, also shows that when agency staff are included, the 2021 Northern Ireland Civil Service headcount number, not full-time equivalent number, has returned to the 2016 levels. Is the committee content to write again to the Department of Finance seeking clarity on the changes to the NI Civil Service and wider public sector headcount and numbers of full-time equivalents, and asking it to answer the question in relation to the Public Sector Transformation Fund risks and the role of the Northern Ireland Civil Service Board? Are we agreed? Agreed. Is the committee also content to write to the Controller and Auditor General and ask if the Northern Ireland Audit Office will revisit this report on 2016 into the voluntary exit scheme and to determine its overall impact and effectiveness? I think that would be opposite. Agreed? Agreed. Next item of correspondence, COVID support for the hospitality sector. The committee is asked to note at page 437 departmental response to the committee's request for clarity on the reported delay and timing of next steps of the COVID hospitality sector support scheme. The Department advises that payments will be issued week commencing the 24th of January 2022. Any comments? Any MLAs had any correspondence or any communication with people who have not had it? Or it's not started?
It should be arriving.
Yeah.
I haven't heard anybody got it yet.
I haven't had any people contacting my office and said it hasn't. Anybody?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Are we content to note then? Agreed. Next item on the agenda, non-domestic rates valuation 2023. The committee is asked to note at page 440 departmental correspondence regarding the decapitalisation rate consultation. The consultation was on whether the decap rates should continue to be prescribed in legislation, the number of prescribed rates and how the rates should be calculated. The related statutory rule will be brought forward shortly. Is the committee content to note this correspondence pending receipt of the statutory rule? Intended to note.
Yep.
ACM cladding. The committee is asked to note on page 451 a departmental response to committee requests for the estimated overall cost in respect of the aluminium composite material repairs. The department can't estimate the final ACM costs, but they appear to be less than the £1 million fund. The department clarifies that the building safety regulator. The Building Safety Regulator role is under review as the relevant Westminster legislation has not yet been passed. Are we content to note this correspondence? Yeah, thank you. Northern Ireland Civil Service absence rates. The committee is asked to note on page 454 a departmental response to committee's request for information on the Northern Ireland Civil Service sickness absence detailed in the recent NICS report. The Department doesn't answer the question as to why absence rates have returned to pre-COVID levels. It indicates what categories the increases fall under: chest and respiratory illnesses plus stress. Is the committee content to note this correspondence, or is there anything further we would like to ask? I would probably ask this: the chest and respiratory illness, is that long COVID? Part and parcel of it? Okay. Yeah. Just any others? Okay.
Just on that, on the table on page 455.
Yeah.
Just for clarity, we're looking at obviously the differential percentages between the period July 20, September 20 to July 20. So it's effectively 1 year later, and the increase, am I correct in reading that right? Yeah.
That's right. So overall, it was an increase of about 50%. So they're back to, I think, the levels they were at, which I think was what the Permanent Secretary said previously. So, but that's where the increases are coming from: anxiety, stress, depression, other psychiatric illnesses, and chest and respiratory problems. But again, right re-COVID, Chairperson, if that's agreed.
Yep. Yes, please. Agreed. Okay, Troubles Permanent Disablement Payment Scheme. The committee is asked to note at page 457 TO correspondence on roles and responsibilities for the Troubles Permanent Disablement Payment Scheme. Department of Finance responsibility is limited to long-term funding and dispute resolution with the United Kingdom Government. Any comments? Okay, is the committee content to note this correspondence? Thank you. Great. Next item is the Dormant Account Funds, January 2022. The committee is asked to note at page 462 the January 2022 update on the Dormant Accounts Fund. Over £6 million of funds have been allocated. A list of projects is appended. Are we content to note? Noted. Common Frameworks. The committee is asked to consider at page 489 correspondence from the Committee for the TEO, asking for the committee's views regarding their experience of the scrutiny of common frameworks. There is one common framework within Department of Finance, public procurement. The committee has scrutinised this document. Is the committee content to respond to the Committee for the TEO, indicating that the committee has undertaken scrutiny of the relevant framework, but that it is high-level nature makes this process difficult? I think we're agreed on that. Agreed. Budget 22-25. The committee is asked to note at page 492 correspondence from the Committee for DERA, outlining its discontent about the lack of provision of papers in relation to its 22-25 multi-year budget proposals. Isn't that supposed to be part of, was it not supposed to be dealt with by the MOUs and also Mr. Alistair's bill?
No, I think not. My recollection is Mr. Alistair's bill deals with monitoring rounds. Could be wrong. I'll follow up with the Committee for Agriculture and see if anything's happening. Maybe has the department thought better of it and decided to provide papers, because there's a couple of weeks to go yet, but I'll go back to them if the committee's content. Okay. Are we content to note this correspondence with that action? Agreed. January monitoring round. Members are asked to note 494 correspondence from the Committee for Education and January monitoring round. Are we content to note? Noted. Composite information request is at page 495. Are we content this is an accurate and complete record of the committee's information request? Is this agreed? Agreed. Moving on to the forward work programme. A draft forward work programme is at page 514. Members asked to note that next week the department has asked for a few additions to the agenda. The committee will receive a briefing on subordinate legislation relating to fire safety and building cladding. It will also receive an oral briefing on another LCM which relates to the Architects Act. Is the committee content with the revised agenda for next week? Agreed. Chair, is the committee also content for me to... The Architects Act is about changes to architects, CPD and such like. So is the committee content for me to write to the Royal Society of Ulster Architects and just seek their views on that, so they might inform member scrutiny next week?
Okay. So the Architects Act, it's specifically building safety components in the Architects Act?
Yeah, it's falling from the, so to speak, from the Grenfell legislation. So there's stuff then for architects, and for some reason that, well, it isn't reserved, so it's devolved. And I think the RSUA responded to the levelling up department's consultation on this. They may have something to say.
Yeah. Okay. Are we agreed? Agreed. Thank you. The committee will also receive a brief on Reval 2023 and rates debt management issues from LPS on the 9th of March. Is the committee content with the forward work programme as agreed or as amended? Yep. Agreed. Thank you. Any other business?
Is there not a letter from the Minister? About the Stormont Estate?
That's in next week's correspondence.
Right.
I emailed it to members because it was on the news.
Yeah, so it's not right. So it'll be in. We can deal with it next week.
Yeah, do it next week.
I think.
Thank you, Judge. Just to inform the committee, remember the pigeon that Great crashed the Zoom meeting of the Finance Committee? It's just that there was a clip featured on German TV show 2 weeks ago. So my daughter lives in Munich, informed me. So you're all famous now out in Germany.
I thought you were going to tell us the pigeon had died.
No.
Okay, team. Thanks very much indeed. Thanks very much indeed for helping us get through this as well. So next week, 1400 in here. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. 2, 3, 4.
This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Senate.